Good morning. I'm Michelle Flournoy. I'm the CEO of the Center for a New American Security, and really glad to see you all here this morning. This event on women in leadership is the first of a series that CNAS will be hosting on women in national security over the next couple of years. Over the past 35 years, since the first woman graduated from a military academy in the United States, women have grown to be about 12% of the deployed force in the U.S. military. And yet, women are all too rare in the military's leadership ranks. Only a handful currently have attained 4-star rank. And similarly, when you look at the private sector and across the Fortune 500 companies, only 27 of the CEOs are women, about 5%. In January, CNAS published our first report in this space called Battlefields and Boardrooms, and I hope you'll all pick up a copy outside. In this report, authors Dave Barno, Nora Bensahel, Kate Kidder, and Kelly Saylor examined and compared the experiences of women in the military and women in the private sector, drawing insights and concrete recommendations in regard to both. Today, with the generous support of Bank of America, and we're very grateful for that, we are going to draw on this work to really launch a public dialogue on women in leadership, a dialogue that we hope to sustain over the next months and years ahead. So you may be wondering why this topic and why now? You know, when you think about the incredible challenges that the United States is facing in the global security environment, it's clear that now is a time that we need to draw on all of the talent, the best and the brightest that the country has to offer, to chart America's course and to lead in a very challenging security environment. We need to leverage all the talent and all the human resources we have to compete and lead in this challenging world. Furthermore, for those of you who, like me, go home and secretly read your Harvard Business School reviews at night, you'll know what the business literature has to say on this. It's very, very clear. Leaders make better decisions. Organizations perform better when they draw on the talents and views and perspectives and experience of more diverse teams. So including women in national security is not only an issue of equality and fairness. It is an issue of leveraging talent and enhancing performance. Figuring out how to fully leverage women in the military and defense and other related domains of national security, that's what we're here to talk about. We intend to explore these issues as part of a much larger research effort over the next 2 years, looking at the future of the all-volunteer force. We'll look at the human capital and talent management dimensions of the United States defense needs and offer concrete recommendations for policymakers. How should we recruit, educate, train, select, promote, compensate, evaluate, motivate the force of the future? How do we fully leverage the talent, the incredible talent and diversity of the American people in doing so? So that's the larger frame for today's discussion, and I'd like now to turn it over to Phil Carter, who is our program director for the Military, Veterans, and Society program, to lead the first discussion. Thanks so much, Phil.
I'm thrilled to be joined on this panel by a star-studded group, and I mean that in every sense. Starting with Dave Barno, retired Army 3-star general, whose second to last assignment was commanding all U.S. and allied forces in Afghanistan. Before that, he had a long and storied career in the Ranger community and the Army's infantry community. To his left and your right is Rear Admiral Peg Klein, who's a 1981 graduate of the Naval Academy and a naval flight officer by training. For us non-Navy people, that's like Goose from Top Gun. Recently, she served as Commandant of the Naval Academy. She currently serves as Senior Advisor to the Secretary of Defense for military professionalism issues. To her left and your right is Lieutenant Colonel Heather Penny, Air Force National Guard, an F-16 pilot. You get a sense we have lots of Type A personalities on the panel this morning. Iraq veteran, now working with Lockheed on Air Force issues, and in particular, leading the Chief of Staff of the Air Force's effort to study and recommend ideas for officer retention, female officer retention, talent management, and related issues. And finally, I'm joined by Louis Runyon, who is a former Army officer and distinguished parachutist, among other things, and now leads the Military Affairs Group at the Bank of America. And I want to jump right into our conversation for a little while and then open it up to engage all of you in this discussion. With the first question for Dave. You have a long career leading men and women in uniform. You come out to CNAS, you write this report, and you could have taken a narrow frame to focus on the issues du jour in the headlines, sexual assault, issues of ethics in our general officer corps, et cetera, but you didn't. You wrote a much broader paper on women and leadership and really the health of the all-volunteer force in general. I was wondering if you could explain why you wrote this paper and some of the most interesting things you found.
Sure, and again, I'd commend the report to you, which is outside, and I'm the second best person in the room to talk about this. The best person is Dr. Nora Ben-Sahel in the front row, who's the lead author, recovering from surgery. She'd be sitting up here today instead of me. But it's a great topic, and when we were all seized as we began the research for this here almost a year ago to get into the details and do research that, as best we could tell, has really perhaps never been done in looking at leadership of women in the military and the private sector in comparison. And what we found is far more common challenges, far more of a common framework between those two very different worlds than we would have expected. But to your point, Phil, this is actually about leadership, and this is something I brought out of my time in the Army as well. I was in all-male units for the first 20 years I was in the Army, and then I suddenly found myself leading about 2,000 soldiers, 20% of whom were women, and as I got to know what their challenges were, I was shocked by the world they were living in. And that kind of changed my outlook very dramatically. The Army went through a lot of travails back in that era in the 90s with sexual harassment, with the Aberdeen scandal, and in my view, missed the target in trying to fix that. And they missed it because they didn't aim at leadership. This report is about leadership, and the challenges that we're facing are leadership challenges. They're not, let's invent a special program to fix this problem. They're how we better understand leadership, how we get men involved in understanding how to own this space and be part of the solution to deliver the full range of talent that we want to have the nation have access to.
So that's a perfect segue to Peg. I mean, you've got the Secretary's ear on this subject, and not just this subject, but the broad array of ethics and professionalism and leadership issues that our force is wrestling with as they come out of 14 years of war and go into something that might be a long struggle. What's your perspective from your perch in OSD, and in particular, how does the issue of women in leadership connect to these broader issues that you're working on?
Sure, thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. So in my job as the Secretary's advisor on military professionalism, we've been working very closely with the services. And rather than attacking each of the individual symptoms or problems that we've seen over the last couple of years, what we've looked at what the services are already doing. And each of the services has a tremendous initiative. The Army has General Bob Brown looking at the human dimension out at the Combined Arms Center. The Navy has recently stood up their Navy Leadership and Ethics Center, elevating it from a directorship to a command. The Air Force, I was just out at the Air Force Academy last week where General Michelle Johnson, Air Force Class of '81, was hosting the National Conference on Leadership. And invited people from all over the globe, as well as the other service academies. We have the Coast Guard pulling well above their weight, and then the Marine Corps has their Lejeune Leadership Institute, where they are studying leadership and looking at what the most impactful programs are, not just putting programs out there to be able to say we have a program.
And Heather, you've done some pretty path-breaking research on this, and one of the things when we talked earlier and have looked in your work is the connection between talent management and readiness. That this is not just an HR issue. This is not something that's just the province of personnel officers. This is really bigger than that, and it goes to what Michelle was talking about, that this is how we maintain readiness, how we project power. Tell us a little bit more of your work in this space and why this is so important.
Well, absolutely. So one of the things is we began to look and do research into female retention and the overlap of female retention diversity, as well as just the health of the force. So I'd like to disabuse people of the notion that female retention is a social issue or has a political agenda. It really is very tightly connected to the readiness and the health of the force, because as we found, women are actually the lead indicators. We're the canary in the coal mine for what is happening with the millennial generation, as well as a broader talent pool that the services have to draw upon. So as many people know, we have a crisis, if you will, regarding where we are with our fiscal constraints, pressures from downward budgets, and aging fleets, both in the Air Force and the Navy, and the Army is looking at recapitalization as well. In some cases, it doesn't matter how many new widgets you get if you don't have the right people to be able to operate them. At the same time, focusing solely on people to the exclusion of modernization and recapitalization is just as much of a disservice. So we have to look at both of those together.
That's terrific. And I guess to close out this round, Louis, you come from Bank of America, but you've also got a military background. And one thing that we tried to do with this report was find some common ground between what the private sector sees in this space and also what the military sees. Based on your background and your work, I mean, why did the bank get involved in this effort, and why does this matter in the private sector?
First of all, from the bank's perspective, we've been supporting the military since 1920. We have a huge hiring effort, as do many companies. Last year we hired 2,008 veterans. 36% of those were females. And so that's important for me to understand the transitioning force. Most importantly, personally, I'm a veteran, and you know, we thought that there might be some unique challenges that the female transitioning force is facing that the males are not. So I think we collectively kind of maybe had a couple of adult cocktails and said, what does this, what does a project like this look like? And so that's what the interest for us was, because we want to harness the talent of the veterans that are coming in, specifically in this case the female veteran, understand what those challenges would be and how we better leverage the leadership that they come to us with. I'm looking at a colleague of mine who's sitting in the audience now, who's a C-17 pilot, Erica Paolo, still in the Air Force Reserve. How do I help her transition easily from the Air Force, leverage those leadership skills that she has, and then train her on a new opportunity?
And I think one of the insights that both you and Heather contributed is it really connects to the bottom line. In the military, it's to readiness or it's to combat effectiveness. In the private sector, it's to the bottom line, whether it's in the retention value you keep or it's your effectiveness. I guess back to you, Dave. So you've commanded both all-male units in the testosterone charge environment of the Ranger Battalion, and then, you know, commanded Fort Jackson, commanded troops in Afghanistan. Connect this to your experience as a commander. You're leading these units. You're leading them in very difficult situations. Why does it matter that you have this environment of trust, that everyone can work together, everyone can contribute their best? I mean, for those of us who have not been where you have been, why is this so important at the tip of the spear?
Yeah, I think that anyone who served in the military, particularly in combat units, recognizes that that's the glue that binds those units together. You know everyone, you trust them, they've got your back. I remember as a paratrooper, one of the things you do before you jump out of the airplane is the paratrooper behind you checks your static line, which is going to pull your parachute open when you go out that open door and fall 800 feet. And if he's not doing his job or her job, you're at huge risk. So you're trusting the people around you literally with your life in a lot of cases. And so that's one of the areas where I think, going back to leadership, in a sense we've got leadership not taking an active enough stance, I think, to make sure that this trust doesn't continue to fray. It's definitely frayed, and I'm not sure these problems have actually improved a whole lot from when I saw them in the 90s as a brigade commander in many ways. They've improved some. I saw another version of that in 2001 and 2002 at Fort Jackson, where I had about half of the women being trained in basic training in the Army coming through there every year, and we had challenges there. But it's the leadership have got to get their arms around this, and it's got to be a core component of leadership that I own this space. I'm going to own making sure my unit, forges those bonds of trust and no one violates them.
In addition to those horizontal bonds of trust in the unit, you also talk a lot in the report about the sort of vertical mentor relationships that leaders can take on to really bring up the next generation of people behind them and create this environment. You talk a little about that recommendation and why you thought that was so important?
We thought that was one of the most significant things that we found both in the military side and in the private sector side, is that the role of mentors in advancing women and giving them advice and giving them counsel, and a step beyond mentorship, to be a sponsor, to actually be an advocate for women and for this job they might not have the confidence that they think they can do, for this position that they didn't know about, and the people around that position didn't know about them. So we found that was a critical step, and that we also found through surveys that we researched that men and women are about equally likely to have sponsors, but men are much more likely, particularly in the private sector, men are much more likely to have advocates, people that are pushing them forward for these jobs. And the other interesting and critical part here, back to men owning this challenge as well, is that almost all the women we spoke with, at all levels up to CEO and all levels up to generals in the military, had men as their most significant mentors as they came up through the ranks. And that's partly because of the demographics, of course. That's where men are in those positions, and in combat arms, men are exclusively in those positions in parts of the military. And so the role of men being mentors for young women coming up through the rank, being advocates for them, being sponsors of them is critical. And that came through loud and clear in both the military and the private sector.
So I would also add to that, in all the veterans that we're hiring, we find the most successful transitions are the ones that have mentors, whether they're a vet or non-vet, that help them onboard into the company. What we could probably do a better job is continuing those mentorships beyond those first or second year.
So Heather, Peg, join the conversation. You've been the beneficiary. You've also been the mentors. How do you create those environments?
So it's interesting, as Dave was talking about mentorship, that was a big topic out at the National Conference on Leadership out at the Air Force Academy last week, is mentorship. And it's both giving and receiving, right? So if you're the beneficiary, and all my mentors were men, right? Because those were the people who were senior to me. I think I've worked for a woman once in over 30 years, and that was for a short period of time. So mentorship, so whether it's male or female, important to have a good mentor. But your point about advocacy is spot on, because you can't just be giving advice to the individual. You have to be the voice to the institution that says, no, here's what, she may not look like everybody else, but she has a lot to add to the institution.
And I'd like to shift the conversation just a little bit from the mentorship sponsorship to this notion that we need to bring men into the conversation as well. So in our studies, we found that 30% happens to be the magic number for a variety of different issues regarding women in the workplace and women in the military. So when you look at the business reviews, the Harvard Business Reviews, and the studies that have been done by places like McKinsey and Catalyst, women who had company boards that had 30% women performed significantly better in a number of different measures with regards to other companies that were dominated by men. Similarly, when you look at cultural elements, 30% happens to be the tipping point to be able to shift culture from really a dominant majority. You need 30% minority to begin to begin that path of transformation. But when the services only bring in around 20% is the accession rate for women, even if you maintain the same retention, which right now we do not, women leave the service at twice the rate of men. Even if we were to be able to maintain the same retention for women, we would never get to that 30% point. So we need to have men really become the other 10% in order to be able to create this transformation, which is another reason why the mentorship and sponsorship is so important.
And you've done some particular research that I found fascinating on these dynamics in air crews and small units, and the difference that it makes if you've got a female crew member versus a female aircraft commander. Can you tell us about that?
We call it the gunship effect. So if you have a young airman who's an AC-130, she's a waist gunner in a C-130, and the rest of her crew are men, she's going to be co-opted into that culture. She's going to be co-opted into whatever that group dynamic might be, whether or not it's sort of a fraternity or a locker room type culture. She's going to participate because being part of that group, creating group cohesion and trust is essential, and she's not going to become an outlier. But when you have, for example, a woman being the aircraft commander, that we call, like I said, we call the C-130 gunship effect, individuals will not behave inappropriately. They will behave in response to her expectations of behavior. So women in leadership will have a natural transformational impact on an organization simply by being in that leadership position. I do need to caveat this because it is a complex dynamic. Being a warfighter is still very much an art. You need to be part of the group in order to have the more experienced warfighters invest in you to teach you the methods of being an operator, of being a warfighter. If you stand outside of that group, you risk not being invested in and therefore not really achieving the level of expertise and performance capable. So being part of that group and co-opted into those value sets can potentially derail the gunship effect.
And so the gunship effect is not just true of air crews, it's true of
Absolutely.
tank crews, it's true of submarine crews, it's true of infantry squads. And Dave and others, the Army and the Marine Corps are going through a bit of a crucible right now on this as they seek to open up their combat billets or at least study that. The first women have qualified for Ranger School, an experience you know very well. What's your perspective on this? How do you think that you get women leaders in some of those more difficult environments where group dynamics play such a key role?
One of my takeaways is that in looking at this, and I spent a good bit of my life in the Ranger Regiment. I went to Ranger School at 19 years of age, which was a very unsmart thing to do for a 19-year-old, and survived. And as I look at this now for the Army, so I'm kind of steeped in that culture from the Army. For the Army, the first woman with a Ranger tab is going to break down all the barriers. When that happens, the first one, the first 5, the first 10, when they walk in front of a platoon of infantrymen with a Ranger tab as a woman second lieutenant platoon leader, it will change all the dynamics because there's so much respect accorded to getting through that crucible, which is incredibly intense 9 weeks of sleep deprivation, long range patrolling, 1 meal a day. So people that get through that have innate respect because of what that means. The first women that go through that are going to be accorded that automatically. And so in my view, that's going to be game over in terms of questions for at least that part of the Army. If you're, and these aren't Ranger Regiment or Ranger Battalions per se, but a cavalry squadron that has a troop leader that's got a Ranger tab, or an infantry platoon with a leader that's got a Ranger tab, that's going to make a big difference. And so I'm really watching this carefully. I'm a little bit concerned on where it's going right now. But those things are symbolic. And they're not just physical. There's much about mental toughness and resilience and the ability to put one foot in front of another day after day after day after day under pressure. That's what the value of that comes from. And women can do that, in my estimation, my experience, equally well as men.
So before we open up to questions, I just want to kind of go around one last thing. I mean, pull out your crystal ball. What's the next challenge in front of the services that they really have to tackle in this space? Or, again, Heather, to some of the work that you've done, as we look at generational change in the military, how does that impact this? How do millennials, post-millennials see these problems differently, and how do the services need to change, or in the private sector's case, change the way that they do business to fit the new reality? We'll start with Lewis.
Well, first of all, I want to comment on our last conversation. The gunship effect actually is in place in corporate America too. So trading, it works at trading desks, it works in financial advisory teams and banking centers. In particular, when it comes to leadership and transitioning veterans out, those are the things that I want to look for to be able to take a West Point graduate, Yale MBA, MP, military police company commander, and put her on those teams and really show that example of leadership that she has earned over the past 20 or 22 years. So that's important for us. That's how one of the ways that we see veterans changing our culture. And so to your second point, Phil, we think that DOD needs to do a better job of prepping veterans, not just females, but veterans in general in transition. We need to have these discussions. What are the parallels in public and private sector? So if we look at things like veterans as a whole are very shy about their accomplishments. Female veterans are even more shy about that. And so when you come to me to interview, I want to know what you did. You have to sell yourself on that. And those are the things that are important. I'm not hiring you for your keen financial background. I'm not hiring you because you're a military police company commander. I'm hiring you because of the leadership abilities that you bring to the team and the educational background that you have.
So I think the next challenge that is really going to face the DOD is transforming how we manage our assignment and our personnel systems. So as we began to conduct numerous anecdotal interviews, and we began to look at the other research that had been compiled, it became very clear to us that the way that the services manage our people is fundamentally predicated upon a 1950s nuclear family with a stay-at-home domestic portable spouse. That doesn't look like America anymore. And so if we continue down this path, we will either be breaking families in order to continue to serve, or we will be unnecessarily limiting our talent pool. As we began to look and talk more with women regarding their retention decisions, we also conducted a lot of surveys among men as well, and interviews among men. And within the company grade and young major, young 04 level, we found that their value sets more closely mirrored that of women. And so we began to investigate millennial data. And this is one of the reasons why we believe that the dynamics that you see occurring and the choices and decisions that you see occurring with women are the lead indicators for what will happen to the health of our force, because millennials look more like women in terms of their values and their decision matrices. So if we don't do something to accommodate the flexibility, agency, transparency that is necessary to be able to retain women, we will be losing not just them, but we'll be losing some of our most talented millennials, which right now comprise about 60% of our force. If you just look at the year data, we risk losing a tremendous amount of that as well. So how we do that, how we do that gracefully without disrupting careers, and how do we transform that within the constraints of DOTMA and what a post-DOTMA, which is the Defense Officer Personnel Management Act of 1980, which defines how officers and the timeline for their promotions, how we look at that is really, I think, the next biggest challenge that the services have.
So I would tell you that as the services all focus on leadership development programs, there's a couple areas where we are going to have to advance. First is, one of the beautiful things I think that millennials bring to the table is their demand for transparency. And I think that as an organization, as an institution, we tend kind of automatically to be fairly opaque for all kinds of reasons that have worked for decades and decades. But when it comes to people, when it comes to people talking the talk and then walking the talk, the millennials ask more questions. That when they see somebody departing from their service's core values, they get on and they blog about it. We talked about it. We frequently talked about it in our small social circles, but millennials talk about it in public. And in many respects, that's really healthy, where it can be an agent to bring discrepancies to light and get them corrected, which doesn't have to mean shooting somebody or tossing the person over the side. There's got to be an ability to rehabilitate people. But that also brings me to the second thing that we have to mature in is right now we're really good at documenting those tangible characteristics in our performance system, in our performance and evaluation system. What we are not quite as good at is documenting those tangible qualities that help create trust, that help create that culture of dignity and respect that is so necessary for leaders going into the future.
Yeah, very briefly, I would second the notion that keeping millennials, men and women in the force, is going to be an immense challenge. I have two sons that are Army officers. One just got out. The other one's teetering on the edge. They're both of the millennial generation. They don't look at the world the way I looked at the world. Their value system is very much about quality of life, not what the orders say and what the paycheck is and moving every 2 years and never getting to establish family. They're not going to do that. And so Heather's exactly right. That's going to be a huge challenge. I think beyond that, looking in this space in particular, the thing I worry about is that we have essentially balkanized women's issues inside parts of the military. That we've carved these out as a separate space, helped by our friends in Congress to some extent. But also because our response to problems is always create a new program, put a label on it. People take PowerPoint training on it and recertify every 6 months. And that's driving those people out of the military because no one wants to live in that kind of a world. That's the world, that's how the military, that's the reflex response to that. Going right back to what I saw in the 90s, the problem is leadership has to be about owning that problem, building the trust, and realizing anyone that violates that trust needs to be dealt with severely. And that's what the services all say they value most. I mean, if I was to put a dot in every service and say, and everybody has their various coda that they have that are their service values, but leadership is so sacred in the services that if you finally connect this problem to a failure of all of your leadership out there, it may get some resonance. Right now, it's in some ways almost men versus women, and that's a very bad place to be. And I see this in how my sons are having to deal with these various applique programs coming down from on high to fix these issues. It's a very bad place.
Terrific. We now have a good amount of time for question and answer with the audience. We want to invite you to join our conversation. We have three microphones set up here. So please come up to the mic. Please be respectful in your question and also ask a question to the extent that you're able to so that we can give our panelists a chance to respond. And we have one person starting. Terrific. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Mitzi Wertheim with the Naval Postgraduate School, but I was the first female political appointee at the Navy in 1977. I can assure you they didn't want me. And I've been spending a lot of time thinking about educating our young military. One of the things I came across, which I thought was really stunning, when I came to the military, that in the room, the 4-star spoke, and then the 3-star, and then the 2-star, and then the 1-star. I mean, it just went down that way. It's just part of the culture. I was at Apple a couple of weeks ago, and the fellow who was helping me must have been at least 45 years old, an African-American. He had some white. I said, how did you learn how to do all this stuff? Because usually it's 25-year-olds. He said, at Apple, when we're getting trained, if you don't know, you ask. And I actually think that would be a traumatic and extraordinary change in the military if you were allowed to ask if you didn't understand. The cultural component of that is you're exposing your ignorance, and what you really should say is, we don't want anybody to walk out of this room that hasn't understood what he or she has been listening to. And I throw that into the whole question of building trust, which, no question, but unless the leadership says, tell me what you don't know, I mean, the worst thing you want to do is go sit for an hour and not understand what was being said.
So that's great. Dave?
Yeah, let me flip that around a little bit, because one of the things we found when we went out, our team went out and interviewed military women and even women in the corporate sector in both categories, one of the other commonalities we found is just ask us. Just ask us and we'll tell you what the problems are. We'll tell you what some of the solutions are. We were taken aback that we didn't have to pull any answers out of people. We were flooded with ideas, with issues, with concerns, with answers. And we were also flooded with the obvious conclusion that no one is asking these questions. And this is probably more true, I thought, in the military. The amount of effusive response we got to someone's finally coming out to ask us some questions about these issues. That's never happened before. That was kind of jarring. And I think so, to flip Mitzi's question around, within the services we've also got to be willing to ask the question and get down at the grassroots level and talk to people and listen to what they say and take some action on it.
Does this highlight a broader issue? I mean, and Peg, we've had this discussion about the need for feedback and, to your point earlier, transparency and more of a dialogue between, superior, subordinate, peers in a way that really engenders a trusting environment.
Yeah, so I have to tell you that as I've gone around to various groups of people, we have similar conversations. We talk to them about what we think good looks like, good leaders, good trust, good transparency, and dignity and respect, and we too are flooded with answers. And so there is a great desire to have this dialogue, we have lots of dialogues built into our schedules, and at the operational level, at the unit level, they're usually built in those tactical and tangible things that build readiness. Well, the feedback that we get is that these conversations build readiness by building trust, which builds combat effectiveness.
Mitzi, I would add to your comment that it is the institution that's providing that culture of ask the question. So we, right, Right. We have similar challenges with millennials that you do. So when I was a young private, my first day of basic training, I was taught if there are two people, one of you are in charge. If you ask a millennial who's in charge, not me. We have similar challenges that you do, and I think having to inculcate them with the ideas and cultures, as to Mitzi's point, it's okay to, in fact, we encourage you to ask questions. Sometimes it's good to challenge the system, sometimes not, but we do encourage you to ask questions.
I'd like to take...
Right.
It's unless you recognize they have to learn what to do. If they don't understand, we as a taxpayer are being cheated.
I'd like to take the conversation into a little bit of a different direction because, as we all know, what matters gets measured, and what gets measured matters. So as a result, we can use officer personnel reports, annual evaluations, as well as, I think, 360-degree reviews as a way to create transformational cultural change. Because as we look at how we assess our officers, it's very often driven in how did you perform in your job? And it is unidirectional. It is from the top and it's only looking down. So we really lack the opportunity to be able to assess how do peers respect and how do they look at each other, as well as how are our individuals, how are our officers performing in terms of supervising and creating a culture in an organization. And so as we look at 360-degree reviews, we have the opportunity to not only measure the effectiveness of that particular officer and get to some of those more subjective qualities that I think the military is very anxious about. We really like to have objective, hard data. But I think as we look at this leadership problem and we look at culture, that we need to create an opportunity for data on something that is subjective. And so we can create some of that cultural change through those methods. It's about incentivizing.
We have another question in the back. Alice?
Thank you. My name is Alice Friend. I'm an adjunct senior fellow at CNAS, and I'm also doing my doctoral work at American University. I'm curious about the role of civilians at the Department of Defense. I was in OSD for 5 years, and it struck me that there could have been more mentoring going back and forth between women in the services and women in OSD, but also leadership at OSD, both male and female, has to think about these issues too, and so I'm curious what the panel has to say about that.
So let me take a shot at that as I think the only person who works in the building. Yeah. So pretty recent, right now, today.
Thankfully.
I'd like to keep it that way. So it's interesting. There's a couple different dynamics. It's pretty interesting. I'm a recent addition to the Pentagon. I went 32 years because of the history of the combat exclusion law. I went to sea for the second half of my career, and then came to the Pentagon just in the last 2 years. So it's pretty interesting. I always heard about the Pentagon Athletic Center, right, which was the Pentagon Officer Athletic Center, but it's now the Pentagon Athletic Center. The women's locker room is a pretty interesting networking opportunity. It's really interesting. I have met more women in the PAC women's locker room than I have just walking the halls of the locker room. And so that's civilian women and those of us in uniform across the services. So that's one dynamic that's pretty interesting. One of the things that we have looked at as we've talked to the services about leadership development, we've included civilian development in that. And I think all the services would tell you that there's more work to do in civilian development, not just in the structure of how we recruit civilians in and then encourage them to go through the ranks, because I'm not sure that there is an institutional encouragement for people to go up through the ranks. I think that's largely based on advocacy and mentorship. But there are some really good conversations that are spreading across to the civilian side of each of the services based on what we're finding in the leadership development on the officer and enlisted side.
There are probably 3 macro trends that are sort of competing right now with respect to creating the human capital pipeline for civilians in OSD as well as across the national security bureaucracy. More women are going to graduate school than men right now, and that's particularly true in the social sciences and management and law disciplines. The second is the impact of federal veterans preferences and the way that has skewed federal hiring in a way that in some ways counteracts and trumps the first trend with respect to shaping the civilian workforce. And the third is the continuing use of contractors for so much of our institutional capacity, which is neutral on the issue of gender, although a slight edge may go to women there because of the educational credentials they're now acquiring at much higher rates than men. Heather, you work in this space a little bit too. I'm going to turn to you and ask for some thoughts.
Well, I'll move the locus of the conversation into the field, right? So the operational units, where a lot of the service contractors there, especially in training organizations, come from the military. So they retire and they move directly into these organizations. And it is actually, I think, a broader challenge for cultural transformation because most of those individuals are men. They're older. They come from a different generation, different value set, different culture. And as I said, being a warfighter is an apprenticeship. And you do have to conform to the larger group norms in order to be invested in so that you can learn your trade. When these are the individuals that are the stable constituency, they're there for years, it can have a significant impact in changing generational dynamics, young millennials who walk into the service with a certain set of cultural values and beliefs, but then everyone, female or male, then ends up having to normalize to those group codes in order to be able to get that investment. And so I think that when you look at it from an operational standpoint, training out there in the field, that the impact of service contractors has a significant effect.
Terrific. We have another question from Miriam.
Hi, Major Miriam Krieger, United States Air Force. I want to pick up the thread from earlier on the cultural transformation piece, since all the literature out there says that the hardest thing to change in any institution is the culture, partly because if you do a direct frontal assault, you end up creating antibodies that resist any kind of change. I wonder if General Barno, Admiral, if you could speak a little bit to the leadership role in this, and then Heather, I know your report talks to why it's useful to attack structural changes, programmatic changes, policy changes, because it's a way to, in some ways, smuggle in some of these cultural adjustments that will end up making a bigger difference for our force in the future.
I'm going to actually call out Miriam. She has worked with me and co-authored the report that we worked on. So she, if you have other questions, yeah, she's on the inside. If you have additional questions or like a sidebar, she is very knowledgeable on the work that we've done regarding female retention.
Yeah, just I think the idea of antibodies is extremely important, and I think that's one of the things I'm worried the most about. I have a better view inside the Army, but I get sensitive to this in the other services. In some ways, again, purely anecdotally and purely through my contacts and intuition out there, I think we're reaching a tipping point, and too much of a good idea from the top on fixing, whether it's sexual assault problems or rape prevention and these very what are viewed by a lot of people as over-the-top programs. The problem is not over the top. The problem is incredibly serious. It's in some ways endemic, especially sexual harassment. The solution is not to have compliance-based PowerPoint programs that everyone has to participate in. And I'm not sure the solution, although now this is legislatively dictated, is that every officer fitness report will have a category in terms of, in a rating on whether this officer basically has been able to, lead in a way that fosters the environment conducive to both genders. That has gone down very badly in the force. It seems like a great idea. It's a American engineering fix to a problem. In the way that's resonating out there, especially in, I wouldn't even say especially in all male units, but in lots of the force, is that you're pounding us into the ground on this. And again, it goes back to how do you fix it? It's leadership. It's what do we really value? If we value trust, if we value integrity, if we value the individuals and how they fit as a team, if we really are serious about teams, that's where we put our focus. And that's not where the focus is now.
A question over here on the left.
Hi, my name is Jackie Schneider. I'm a PhD fellow at George Washington, and I'm a major in the Air Force Reserves. I did 6 years active duty in the Air Force as an intelligence officer. And I loved your report. It resonated with me. You said, yes, 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 these are all problems I experienced. But what I want to push you on is kind of where the rubber hits the road, which is at the unit, where these significant trade-offs are occurring. So when I was a DO of an intelligence squadron, we had shift work. I had individuals, young women, who were either single parents or who had husbands who were in flexible jobs, like fighter pilots who have crew rest and difficult hours. Those women, we had a lot of trouble figuring out what to do with them. Can we put them on shift? Well, CDC is not open at night. But now, if we don't put them on shift, now we're getting significant resentment from the rest of the unit. So what I was wondering is, in the report, there weren't a lot of recommendations for what to do at the unit level. What are some solutions that there might be for women who have young children or have children, but their husbands are not around for whatever reason? And what solutions does the commander have to solving the problems that are real trade-offs at the unit level?
I think it's a great question, and one of the things we did run into over and over again was disconnects between, fairly, simple, arcane service policies and the realities of women and the challenges they're facing. We found that in one of our sets of interviews that you weren't allowed to bring your child into the Child Development Center for at least a week before you had to be back to your unit. So the rules were I had to be back to my unit X number of weeks after childbirth, but the CDC wouldn't take my child for another week after that. So I had built a system that had my child either abandoned for a week or that I had to figure out some other caregiver for a week. And so the two ends of that couldn't connect. Again, no one ever asked that question of some of the women that we talked to. And so I go back to saying that I think the institutions have to do a very careful scrub of how all these policies and programs and opportunities intersect. And I think they have to put women in charge of doing that instead of having something come down from the IG in Washington to look at that. And so there's a lot of opportunities to fix these things. And again, as we heard from Heather, these are not just women's issues. They're millennial issues. They're generational issues. They're what it's going to take to keep these folks in uniform, men and women both. And we need to we're still in a 20th century military from that regard. And I see that every day.
And those are not issues that are just subject to the military. We have similar challenges in the civilian sector. So how do we work together to help raise these issues to a conversation level that we can actually take some effective action?
And this sort of drives the question of flexibility is necessary for the retention of women and millennials writ large. And that flexibility isn't just in relation to the pacing of their career and what assignments they get and can you meet your promotion gates. It's also a daily flexibility kind of issue. It's a snow day or it's school's open 2 hours late. How do we address that with our parents and our families? How do we accommodate that kind of shift work? And frankly, that's why you have a C prefix, is it requires individual leadership at the unit level to be able to come up with those fixes and create the buy-in from the larger organization, recognizing that what is fair and what is mission-oriented and effective for the unit doesn't mean that you're going to treat everyone the same.
And we don't have C prefixes, so we just have to
Wait, C prefix is a commander.
So, yes, sir, in the middle. You're standing. Okay, yes, ma'am.
Hello. So what specific recommendations would you give to male active duty leaders at all ranks, from NCOs up through officers, who have spent probably the majority of their life in the military, a system that does not have gender equity? They might be encountering women, working with them for the first time. I ask this as an Air Force major who has had several interesting encounters with Rangers in deployments overseas.
Well, from a civilian sector, I would say you better learn how to work with them, because when you leave, they're probably going to be your boss.
Dave, this was your life. You commanded a Ranger battalion, and then you were sort of dropped into a mixed gender unit after that.
Exactly right. So I think the biggest thing I would say is number one, the chain of command in people that they respect, the regimental commander in the Ranger Regiment, the Ranger Battalion commander, the Ranger Company commander, that they say this is important, we are going to do this right, we are going to set the standard for others to follow, which we do in everything we do in the Ranger Regiment. And so you make that clear that this is part of your expectation. And then I think the other thing and the thing that transformed me was sitting down in a room full of your women soldiers and listening to what they had to say about your unit. That peeled my eyebrows back. And I changed a lot of things after that. That was in my first couple months in that organization, but it was clear how endemic the problems were. And it didn't go away or improve completely during my period of time, but at least I understood the problem. And they were my soldiers. That's what was different about it. I owned these women soldiers. They were part of my organization. They were part of the unit I was in charge of and I was responsible for. I think we don't have those dialogues in units that don't have women. And so when that day comes, we're going to have to think about how we get men who've been leaders in these units exposed to not only the expectations, but what the challenges are.
And Peg, how about at your level? I mean, with 2-star, 3-star, 4-star senior officers, how difficult is that conversation?
So I was just going to say, so this is why General Barno is a general, right? Because he got it, right? He listened to those diverse voices who came at him from an entirely different angle and changed. That is not always the case. Sometimes we see this, that, and in the Navy it's not Rangers, sometimes there's a lot of other specialties that are just now having women included, and it's so much not women, it's diversity, right? It's listening to people who don't look or sound like you do and valuing their input, right? As Michelle said at the very start, right, this diversity gives you much more innovative solutions to your problem, and that's the edge that we need to maintain. So the institution, to your answer, Phil, the institution has to value that, so that if you have this tactical and technical genius who has zero people skills, we need to make sure that we balance and weigh all those things as we go through the promotion system, and make sure that we don't just overlook it and say, wow, tactical and technical genius who has always worked inside their comfort zone.
And that's one of the challenges right now. I don't think we have those types of methodologies, and we don't have the ability to screen that in the promotion system. I'm going to talk a little bit about an MIT Carnegie Mellon study, which is actually very fascinating regarding collective intelligence, as well as other findings by the Military Leadership Diversity Council regarding diverse organizations. So the MIT study found that when you had, again, the magic number is 30%, women within a group, the collective intelligence of that group was far higher than even the highest individual IQ. So diverse groups perform at a significantly higher level. Counter that with the findings by the MLDC that diversity had a negative impact on performance within the group. But what was not uncovered by that particular study was that what was valued in that group was sameness. So there's a difference between shared core values and valuing homogeneity. And so when we value homogeneity, looking like each other, talking like each other, that's when organizational performance goes down. When we value mission performance and shared core values like integrity, trust, respect, that's when mission performance goes up. So the agents of cultural change are not necessarily, in my view, going to immediately be women, because we can't meet that 30%. We need the other 10%. But that other 10% of those men, I think, have to be the credible tactical leaders that we look to in our organizations for commanders, because they are the ones that set the tone. They are the ones that enforce through peer pressure and expectations and standards certain behaviors out of individuals. So when you have an individual who is that bad apple, he's that toxic actor, the challenge is that a lot of people will usually remain silent. And silence becomes acceptance, acceptance becomes standard, and then you've set the culture. So we really have to rely upon those commanders to stand up and set that standard.
Can I just add one thing? 10
Last
seconds.
word.
10 seconds. You know, I will admit that our current promotion system probably could use revamping, and that perhaps our evaluation system, though the Army just put a new evaluation system in about 11 months ago. But there are many tools that we have. You mentioned 360s. We have culture and climate surveys. We have so much information that I think we're not yet tapping into. And so there are some things that we have in existence inside the services to be able to use now.
And with that, I want to thank our panel. I'd love to continue the conversation, and we can do so in the lobby after the event, but I'm getting the hook. And I want to leave time for the next distinguished speaker and the next panel after this. So Louis, Heather, Peg, Dave, thank you very much for a terrific job. And please do grab a copy of the report that Dave co-authored with Nora, Kate, and Kelly on Battlefields to Boardrooms. And thank you very much. And I now want to take you all off stage, so that way. We need a sergeant up here to tell us how to march.
All right.
And turn it back over to my boss, Michelle Flournoy.
I don't know about you. I was furiously taking notes on a lot of that conversation. Really, really insightful comments from a wonderful group of speakers. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you our keynote speaker. And it's really both an honor and a real personal pleasure to introduce to you Deborah Lee James. Secretary James is the 23rd Secretary of the Air Force. She is only the second woman in history to serve as a service secretary, the first being Sheila Widnall, who was also Secretary of the Air Force back in the 1990s. Secretary James comes back to the Pentagon after serving in the private sector for 30 years, most recently as president of SAIC's technical and engineering sector. I first got to know her in the Pentagon in the Clinton administration when she was serving as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Reserve Affairs. And I asked her permission to tell a couple of stories, but One was, this was early in the Clinton administration, we decided that we should have a women's leader lunch in the Pentagon. And so a couple of us organized this, sent out all the invitations, gathered every senior woman we could find in the Pentagon, every senior civilian woman. And all 8 of us sat down to lunch at a table in the middle of the Pentagon executive dining room. And the first thing is we all fit at a small table. The second thing that was really interesting, we just had a nice lunch, compared notes. It was really a very informal, casual networking sort of thing, getting to know each other. But for weeks, the conspiracy theories inside the Pentagon of what were the women talking about and why did they all meet together at once and what is going on, what are they planning? It was really quite entertaining and revealing. But the other thing I wanted to mention about that period is this was a period of great strain between our active and reserve components. And what Secretary James did as Assistant Secretary was really to rebuild the relationship between the active and reserve component and sort of come up with a new pact for going forward as a total force. And I think you see now, as she leads in the Air Force context, that same set of incredible, strong, dynamic leadership skills of engagement, stakeholder engagement, inclusion, and just tremendous effectiveness as a senior problem solver and leader in the department. So it is truly an honor to have her make some remarks with us here today, and then once she's finished with remarks, we will have a chance to continue the conversation with her. But please join me in welcoming Secretary of the Air Force, Deborah Lee James.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. Thank you, Michelle, for that, that lovely introduction. Big shout out to everybody at CNAS for bringing all of us together today for this important dialogue. And by the way, Michelle, I am available for lunch. We can really get the tongues wagging if we do that a meal again, just the 2 of us, and people will be wondering what it's all about. Also, thank you very much to the Bank of America for their sponsorship of research in this area. And for everyone here who comes from the private sector, I want to thank all of you for continuing to work hard to ensure the success of all of our veterans, including female veterans who eventually will leave our military and transition into civilian life. I was sitting over here to my right and to your left during the first panel. I thought it was a fantastic discussion, and I think you're going to see I'm going to talk about some of the same themes because many of us who have been studying this area for some time, I think, are in violent agreement about some of the things that need to be focused on for the future. I think everybody knows March is Women's History Month, and 2015 marks the 35th anniversary of the Women's History Movement and the National Women's History Project. But if you step back and ask yourselves for just a moment, why are initiatives like Women's History Month, or for that matter, any initiative that would draw the nation's attention to its diverse population, what's the big deal and what's the so what factor? Why is that important? Well, I would submit it's important because there is no other country in the world as widely diverse as the United States of America, or no other country that is so deeply committed to being a country ultimately unified. And yet, I think as all of us would agree, we've learned over time that being unified does not always mean that we are leading the charge when it comes to inclusion. And of course, that means ensuring that our nation values and thus benefits from the contributions of all of our citizens. So again, if we stick with women as an example, President Carter designated National Women's History Week back in 1980. And at that time, he said, "Men and women have worked together to build this nation. Too often, women were the unsung, and sometimes their contributions went unnoticed. But the achievements, leadership, courage, strength, and love of the women who built America was as vital as that of the men." Well, that was 1980, and of course we are still talking about these very matters and still trying to flesh this out. A 2012 study by the Credit Suisse Research Institute found that companies with female directors outperformed similar-sized businesses without women directors by a whopping 26%. You heard our first panel on some of these statistics. There were similar findings in a 2013 report by Thomson Reuters showing that corporations that had all male boards of directors underperformed in comparison to those with gender diverse boards. So we have not just opinions here, we have some facts. We have data to back up the fact that the value of the female perspective at the corporate senior levels is extremely important, and it translates to better performance. And yet, have we turned the tide? Well, we haven't turned the tide well enough. I think we would all agree with that. So today, women are formed 47% of the labor force, 59% of the college-educated entry-level workforce, but only about 14% of executive officers and 8% of top earners and 4.6% of Fortune 500 CEOs. If you haven't already read cover to cover Battlefields and Boardrooms, you really must do so. I have read it cover to cover, and you will find much of this, of these findings translated from what we've learned about the private sector and many, many similar effects for our warfighting organizations. And certainly all of these challenges are challenges that I have witnessed up close and personal during my 30-plus years, some of which has been in government and some of which has been in industry. I do want to say again, I think there certainly has been progress made. I have seen progress made over the decades, but I still say we can do better and we need to do better. And that's exactly how I feel about our Air Force. I think our Air Force has progressed over time, but again, I'm of the opinion we can do better. So for example, in the Air Force, we lead the Department of Defense with the highest percentage of women in the service, which is about 20%. But if you look at some of our other diversity statistics, we're pretty much middle of the pack when it comes to ethnic diversity. Our junior enlisted force is pretty diverse in our Air Force. But as we go up in rank, the percentage of females and minorities in senior NCO ranks starts to come down. And the same holds true for our officers and our civilians. And in fact, as you heard from the last panel, women, military women, attrit at twice the rate of military men at that mid-career range of years. The same holds true in specific specialties. So we have African Americans comprising almost 6% of the officer corps, but they only make up a little over 2% of the pilot career field. Similarly, females, about 20% of our officer corps, but only 6.7% of the pilot career fields. So being a pilot is not everything in our Air Force, but being a pilot is an important career field, and why aren't we doing better? I could go on and on and on with some of these statistics, but I think the real point, and CNAS has made it, Credit Suisse report has made it, Thomson Reuters has made it, and many other studies confirmed, this is not just about how we look. It's about our readiness, it's our capabilities today and for the future. It's how we are going to perform as an Air Force within the Joint Force in this very uncertain geopolitical environment. Bottom line is, to perform, we need top talent, and we claim the title today very proudly as the world's greatest Air Force, but to remain so, we have to learn to be comprehensively inclusive throughout our ranks and throughout our specialties. And if we get this done right, I'm of the opinion that we are going to glean very significant benefit from the many perspectives of the population we serve. Now, tomorrow, General Mark Welsh and I are going to continue our presentations before the Congress. We'll be talking about our fiscal year 16 budget, number of priorities to include some of our top acquisition programs. And for those of you, many in this audience knows that our top acquisition programs frequently take 10, 20 years, sometimes even longer, to fully mature. And sort of a fundamental question I ask is, are we spending as much time and resources and energy thinking about the next generation of our people, the next generation of our airmen, as we are thinking about the next generation of our aircraft and other forms of platforms in our Air Force? And if we're not, we better get with it, and we better start doing a better job of it. Because you see, just like those acquisition programs, it takes decades to build a senior Air Force leader. As battlefields and boardrooms so correctly notes, our very best newly commissioned female officers, if they start in the year 2016, won't be eligible to be promoted to Brigadier General until 2039. And while all of these items are ongoing, let's not forget that our national demographics are changing, and they're changing rapidly. So in 2012, Latino, Asian, mixed race, and African American births constituted the majority of births in the United States for the first time in our history. So it's not just inevitable that our country will experience a demographic shift, it is already here, it is already upon us. Now, last summer, the Air Force Strategic Framework that General Welsh and I rolled out, which is called A Call to the Future, recognized that the single biggest threat facing our nation in the next 3 decades is the rapid pace of change. This is change in many, many ways, and part of that change is the demographics that I just spoke to you about. And what we need is we need the institutional ability to adapt to this rapid pace of change and to keep up, to keep ahead. This whole area of going faster and being able to adapt to change is something that we call strategic agility. I would submit that diversity and inclusion will help us to become more strategically agile in our Air Force. Diversity to me is having the raw material, meaning the different types of people and the different perspectives and the different backgrounds and the different opinions. And inclusion is how do we put all that together and make it work for us? How do we capitalize on those strengths of the differing opinions and approaches? Well, the Chief and I, needless to say, are pretty passionate about this area of diversity and inclusion, and we mean business. So today, we are signing 2 memoranda, which will go to all airmen that will help guide our efforts. The first memo will explain, just as I have attempted to explain in these last few minutes to all of you, just why diversity and inclusion is so important to our Air Force, to our force at large, why it is important to General Welsh and to me. The second will announce several initiatives which we hope will help build and attract and retain the largest pool of talent that we possibly can to ensure the best 21st century Air Force on the planet. Now, several of these initiatives have already begun, and others are on the very near horizon. There's a total of 9 initiatives that I'd like to share with you all right now, just very briefly. And General Barno, I do want you to know that when I finish speaking, there will be a 4-hour PowerPoint presentation with a requirement to recertify in 6 months. So get ready and take good notes. The first initiative is one that is particularly near and dear to me, and it has to do with mentorship. So as you heard from the first panel, and I couldn't agree more, mentorship is very, very important. It's been important to me in the business world, it was important to me, and it still remains important to me in the world of government. And I have benefited enormously from wonderful mentors that I have had in my life. And I'm a collector of mentors. Mentors can come in all shapes and sizes. You've heard in Women in National Security, most of us have had male mentors through our careers. I had the opportunity to be with one of my best mentors of all time just last night. So a big message I always give out on mentorship is collect these people, value them throughout your career, and remain in touch always, because you will continue to learn. So my mentor that I was with last night is a gentleman, some of you may know him. He's a West Point graduate, a former JAG. I met him 30-some years ago. Bob Kimmett is his name, and I met him when he was on the National Security Council staff in the Reagan White House, and I was his intern. So that's how far back we go, and we have stayed in touch all of these many years. And of course, he progressed on to have a wonderful career, very, very senior positions in state and in the Treasury Department. He was the ambassador to Germany at one point. I progressed through my career. I learned a ton from him 30-some years ago. I continue to learn from him all the time. And one of the things I learned from him is once you progress to a certain point in your career, it is your obligation to pay it forward and do the same for others. And I've always tried to take that to heart as well. Mentors can open doors. They can help airmen maximize their strengths. They play an important role in shaping leaders of character, discipline, and vision. So here we go. Here's our first initiative. It's the Air Force Career Path Tool. This is a web-based enterprise solution that supports the Air Force's Force's mentoring program. So it exists today, but here's the new part. We're going to make it better. One of our airmen, whose name is Airman First Class Lane Rayburn from the Air Force Personnel Command, recently suggested some upgrades to this program, and he specifically suggested a mentor matching capability. So think of a Match.com, but for the mentoring world. Also, a skill finder. So think of a Craigslist for people who are searching for certain skill advice and whatnot. So these are two configurations that we're going to upgrade the tool with. By the way, Airman First Class Rayburn submitted this idea through the Airmen Powered by Innovation website, where we seek to gather great ideas from all of our airmen across the force. And when he did, we listened. So the reconfigured tool will allow airmen to find and request mentors. It will contain forum and live chat capability and also additional features. We're going to rename it My Vector, and it will be open to both civilians and to our military population. By improving our ability to mentor, we hope to nurture and sustain an airman's growth throughout the course of their entire career. Now, mentorship discussions often raise questions about career field development and promotion, and that leads me into our next two initiatives. The second initiative out of 9 is to give specific guidance regarding diversity and inclusion to our career field, what we call development teams, to help shape our future force. Now, by way of background, for some who may not be familiar with the concept of a development teams are big deals in the United States Air Force. Each development team has a chairperson who leads it and has overall responsibility to shape the career field for the future. So, for example, within the 13S career field, which is another way of saying space, the development team is co-chaired by 2 two-star general officers and assisted by 7 senior officers, others who are themselves general officers and colonels. The development team meets twice a year to review year groups approaching a significant career milestone. They identify the best talent to be made available for critical positions and opportunities for command, as well as key developmental education. So General Welsh and I are going to be communicating diversity and inclusion expectations to each of the development team chairs. And specifically, we will be asking them to conduct analyses to address barriers that may be now preventing some of our airmen from reaching their highest levels of performance. And after these teams meet, which the next time they meet will be this summer, we're going to be asking them to provide us the lessons learned and the best practices that they've learned from each other. And we're going to then share those across the Air Force. And to the extent they identify barriers that may be preventing some from rising to additional levels, we're going to do our very best to bring down those barriers. The third initiative will give guidance as well, and this one concerns the promotion boards. Now, again, by way of background, I, as the Secretary of Defense, always provide specific instructions to military promotion board members for every officer promotion and federal recognition board to ensure that we get the best qualified officers selected for promotion or for recognition. And I also have the authority to highlight special areas of concern or focus. So this year, in addition to seeking officers demonstrating commitment to the welfare of our airmen and to our core values, I am using my authority to instruct board members to find officers who have demonstrated that they will nurture and lead in a diverse and inclusive Air Force culture. You see, because by focusing on career development and quality officer promotions, it is my hope that we will help shape the Air Force of the future to be more diverse and inclusive than it is today. Now, one more program that I want to tell you about that is up and running. It was announced about a year ago, and we borrowed this idea from the Navy. So the fourth initiative out of 9 is called the Career Intermission Program, also known as SIP. So our analysis and the Navy's analysis, and really across DoD, of course, has told us for some time now that life issues contribute to some of our top performers' decisions to depart the service. So we developed SIP to allow some of our top-performing airmen the flexibility to transfer from active duty to the IRR, the Individual Ready Reserve, for up to 1 to 3 years, and then come back to us without losing their place in line for promotion, I would say, in order that they be able to meet personal or professional needs and alleviate some work-life concerns. So just as you heard from the first panel, and I agree, looking for ways to provide more flexibility is an important factor in order to help keep some of our terrific airmen with the Air Force, not just for the next few years, but for the long haul. So in 2014, which was the first year that we implemented this program, we had about 32 airmen who took advantage of this program. In 2015, we're going to do the program again, and I would like to see it grow in the future. Just one short story about one airman who has been participated to select, or who was selected to participate, and that is Captain Shannon Williams, who is a C-21 pilot. She flies with the 458th Airlift Squadron at Scott Air Force Base in Illinois. Her job is executive airlift, aeromedical evacuation, and she's also an instructor pilot. As well as, congratulations to Shannon, she's a new mom. Last Thursday, she gave birth to a baby girl named Jillian, and everybody is doing very well. And according to Shannon, if there hadn't been a program in place like the SIP, she would have tried to separate at the earliest possibility. So there's an airman who will be with us now, I hope, for the long haul, but we'll see, that otherwise we would have lost. Once again, keep in mind, SIP is open to all, not just to women, of course, but we hope over time, and particularly as we grow programs and we look for other ways to provide flexibility, that programs like this will help us attack that attrition rate, particularly for females, and particularly at that mid-career point that I talked to you about earlier. Now let me give you just a brief overview of what some of our future holds. The next 4 initiatives, I kind of grouped them together, you might say chronologically, starting with 2 that target young men and women at the very beginning of their careers. So the 5th out of 9 initiatives aims to increase the pool of female officer applicants. Now, there's no question that we're blessed in America to have some extremely bright and talented young people, and we're even more fortunate when some of them choose to come into the Air Force as members of our officer corps. Yet, despite this deep talent pool, our female officer applicants currently comprise only about 25% of our applicant pool. So I'm one who thinks we ought to be able to do better, and let's go for it. Let's try. So we are setting an applicant pool goal of 30%. You heard that 30% from the first panel, right? So we're going to take a stretch goal, 30%. We want our officer accession sources to go after a 30% female applicant pool in the future. And as far as I know, we're the only service doing this particular initiative at this point. The goal will encourage our accession sources, like the Air Force Academy, like those who run ROTC and so forth, to switch it up a little bit, do things a little differently, to try to do more to compete for our nation's top female talent. So the recruiting strategies will need to be adjusted, and we're also going to be establishing partnerships with organizations that mentor and advocate for young women. Over time, again, I'm hopeful that this approach will help build that next generation of female leaders in our officer corps that we all seek to achieve. Now, before I get into the 6th initiative, I want to ask, have you guys seen the Thunderbirds? Many people have heard of the Thunderbirds. It's an aerial demonstration team. I've actually had the opportunity to fly with them, and just a point of personal advice to this audience, if you ever get that opportunity, don't eat lunch first, okay? From me to you. Watch what you eat ahead of time. But my next story is Lieutenant Colonel Nicole Malachowski, an Air Force Academy graduate from 1996, and she was the first female pilot ever selected to fly with the Thunderbirds. And she is an amazing example of the type of airman that we have in our Air Force. She also happens to be 5 feet 4 inches tall, which is 64 inches. Now hang with me a moment. This might not seem particularly important, but let me explain. In order to fly in our Air Force, candidates must meet the standard of a standing height of 64 to 77 inches and a sitting height of 34 to 40 inches. Now, why do we have this standard? Well, the idea is that we have certain cockpits which are very restrictive, others which are less so, but the standard relates to the most restrictive cockpits of all. So that is the way the current standard reads. So you might say, well, what if Nicole had been 5'3" tall? And moreover, what if Nicole had graduated from an ROTC program instead of the Air Force Academy? That would be less than our minimum, and it's a different commissioning source. Well, under today's system, Nicole quite possibly would not have come into our Air Force, at least not into the aviation career field, and that would have been a big loss for us. So fortunately, I'm still with today's system. There is a waiver process in place today for applicants that do not meet the height requirements for these most restrictive of cockpits, but maybe they can meet requirements for some of the cockpits, albeit not all. So the way the waiver process works today is that you can have additional measurements taken in order to determine whether you can qualify for some of the cockpits. Now here's the big hitch with this whole program. Again, I'm still talking about the way it is today. Currently, only those at the Air Force Academy have consistent and easy access to the waiver process. Now you might say, well, why is that? Why don't the ROTC people have access to the waiver process? Well, it turns out, as a practical matter, we have 145 ROTC detachments across the country, most of which are not located anywhere near what is a handful of authorized locations where the medical teams can take these measurements to maybe give you access to that waiver process. And this, in fact, has eliminated about 1/3 of our female cadets and a number of male cadets as well. So when I first learned about this, I thought, boy, this is like trying to recruit an Olympic team, but only looking at every state west of the Mississippi and ignoring the entire eastern part of the country, when in fact you know you have Olympic athlete quality people throughout the country. So anyway, here comes the 6th initiative after that long-winded explanation. We're calling it the ROTC Rated Height Screening Initiative. We need a peppier name for that, but anyway. It's an initiative about the height standards, and it establishes additional opportunities for ROTC cadets now to obtain the appropriate height waivers to maximize, again, the talent base. So specifically, we're going to move this measurement process that I told you, which is access to the waiver process, to the ROTC field training, which takes place each year, to reach the greatest number of cadets and to do it in an efficient manner. And we estimate that approximately 900 women will now have the opportunity to more easily, I'll say, compete, if they wish to compete to be a pilot and to come into, to be able to get access to that waiver process over the next 5 years. So that's our estimate of the impact that this could be at the maximum level. So a key goal of all of this, of course, is to enable more women like Lieutenant Colonel Malachowski, who was recently promoted to, selected for promotion to colonel, by the way, to do everything in the future and to have more fields and possibilities opened up, anything from transporting humanitarian aid to flying fighter missions. So that's the whole idea of changing that process. Now, moving on to those who are already serving, we have 2 more initiatives designed to help retain a diverse and inclusive total force. The 7th initiative recognizes the extraordinary talent resident within our enlisted corps. And I would point to our own Vice Chief of Staff, General Larry Spencer, as a case in point. So for those of you who don't know General Spencer, he enlisted in the Air Force in the 1970s. So he started his life in the Air Force as an enlisted man. In 1980, he was a distinguished graduate from Officer Training School, so he entered the Officer Corps. And today, Larry Spencer is a 4-star general. Now, my question is, how many more potential Larry Spencers do we have out there who are in our enlisted corps right now, today? Well, if Larry were here, he'd say, well, I'm a one and only. What are you talking about? There's nobody else quite like me. But I'm here to tell you, there's more than 65,000 enlisted members who qualify to apply right now, today, for Officer Training School. And more than 6,000 of them are honor graduates from basic military training. And many of them have diverse backgrounds. So to me, this is another pool where we can hope to work on our diversity inclusion initiatives. So our goal will be to identify and encourage more enlisted personnel to apply for officer training school. We're looking for enlisted members who have demonstrated the ability specifically to nurture and lead in a diverse and inclusive Air Force culture, and of course, those who are eligible to attend. And we will encourage this diverse talent pool to apply for the more than 500 OTS slots and provide the tools and opportunities to do so, since we believe in growing talent and diversity from all segments of our force, most especially from within. Next, I think most of you would agree with me that frequent deployments can and do take tolls upon families. For the Air Force, those tolls began in the early 1990s, and given world conditions, I don't see it slowing down anytime soon. And once again, this causes some of our talented airmen to leave the Air Force as they struggle to balance deployments and family issues, and this is especially true soon after childbirth. So to help alleviate some of this strain, the 8th initiative increases our current 6-month post-pregnancy deployment deferment from 6 months, that's what it is today, to 12 months. Again, by way of background, commanders currently have the ability to increase this deferment on a case-by-case basis, but as we looked at it, we thought, why do case-by-case? This should be the standard, and so it will be the standard going forward. The 9th and final initiative targets our senior civilians. And just as I explained about our senior ranks in the military, our senior civilian grades are becoming less diverse over time as you work your way up through the ranks. Now today we don't have a standard for civilian hiring panels. Some commands use panels to hire their civilians and some do not. But our senior civilians, just like our military leaders, can benefit from diverse backgrounds, experiences, demographics, and perspectives in order to provide innovative leadership vision and execution of missions within our Air Force. So in order to increase transparency in the selection process and provide hiring officials broader perspectives and insights on the candidates, we are going to institute and standardize the use of civilian hiring panels for GS 14, 15, and equivalent positions. So these panels will consist of a diverse group of people and will include civilians who have no prior military service. Each panel will have a minimum of 3 individuals, and they will, of course, normally be senior to the advertised grade of the individuals that they will be interviewing. So by building these panels, the whole point is we hope to highlight the best candidates in each applicant pool while also, hopefully, increasing diversity in our higher civilian ranks. This approach has proven successful elsewhere, particularly in the private sector. It's considered a best practice, and so we're going to try it in our Air Force as well. Now, those are the 9 initiatives that I wanted to share with you today, but I want you to know that General Welsh and I don't consider this to be a one-shot and done effort. This is something where we have to keep at it. We're going to have to make sure that we work on it next week and the week after and in the years to come. And there will be additional programs that we will be thinking of. We're working on some additional things that aren't quite ready for prime time at this point. And many of these programs, there'll be more information forthcoming over the next several months. By the way, with respect to the Women in the Service review that is now underway, talked about that a little bit in the first panel. This is, of course, looking at career fields across DoD where those career fields are still closed to women in the military. General Welsh and I are very, very like-minded on this. And by way of background, again, we have 7 career fields closed to women in the Air Force. And General Welsh and I, our position is that we need gender-neutral, job-relevant standards to be put in place, and then these positions need to open. And boy, the burden of proof is going to be heavy on any recommendation to keep any of these positions closed once we have gender-neutral, job-relevant standards in place. So we're still working our way through the process, but I want you all to know we're very much leaning forward on this, at least on behalf of the Air Force. So stay tuned on that. Let me wrap up now by reminding all of you that the National Security Strategy says, above all, we have to take care of our people. We will recruit and retain the best talent while developing leaders who are committed to an ethical and expert profession of arms. And I want to assure you that your Air Force will accelerate efforts to capture the best talent America has to offer while also trying our best to match the changing landscape of our nation. And by affirming our commitment to diversity and inclusion, we hope to amplify the value of our airmen and their families. So I want to thank again to you, Michelle, and to everyone here at CNAS for launching what I think is a very important two-year effort and for spurring better dialogue on this important subject. And I certainly look forward to continuing to be part of it. So thank you.
Sit down in the middle, please. Secretary James, that was tremendous and very, very exciting to hear about the very concrete and fairly comprehensive initiatives that you and General Welsh are launching to address this issue inside the Air Force. You know, we talked a lot in the first panel about changing culture, and this is probably one of the hardest things to do in any organization. With your extensive private sector experience and Pentagon experience, I wanted to draw you out on what do you think the most important levers you have as Secretary of the Air Force to change culture?
A key leverage that I have as Secretary of the Air Force is I do sit at the top of the Air Force, and leadership matters. We've talked about that a great deal in the first panel. And as leader of the Air Force, and of course General Welsh is a very important leader of the Air Force, to state the obvious. So I would hope that days like today, leadership statements like the 2 documents that we are signing out to all airmen today will get the point across that this is important to us personally, this is important to us institutionally. We are going to keep at this. We talked in the first panel about the importance of measurement. So the various programs that I talked to you about, there will be ways to measure these as we go forward. Some of them may not work, in which case we have to be able to look ourselves in the mirror and say, well, okay, so put that one aside. Maybe we won't continue, but let's think of other things that will. And we need to make sure that we communicate and that we keep on it so that leaders at other levels within our Air Force also understand the importance and understand that we'll be looking to them to lead at their levels as well.
One of the things I've learned is, what you celebrate really matters, but also how you hold people accountable really matters. You talked about this idea of celebrating leaders who are already in the Air Force doing the right thing with regard to diversity and inclusion, holding them up as examples, celebrating their success in those examples. The harder part is the accountability question. What is the right way to think about holding accountable people who maybe have the chance to get with the program but ultimately don't get with the program?
Well, this is where I would hope that the instructions to the promotion boards, for example, over time will have some impact. So those who do not demonstrate that they can lead and value a diverse and inclusive Air Force, over time, hopefully that will come through in who we ultimately promote. As you heard, we have laws and regulations on our promotion system, so we have to be very careful that we're not discriminating, that we're always picking the best qualified people for higher level positions. But to get the point across that this is important and we expect this, and those who over time cannot or choose not to understand that point aren't going to thrive in our Air Force perhaps as much as those who do. That is something we're just going to have to keep on. So each of these programs, or I should say none of these programs do I expect will be an individual silver bullet, nor do I expect that all 9 of those initiatives, even when combined, will be a silver bullet. I expect that this is going to continue to be a journey in all of the military, and it will be up to people like me and people who come after me to keep on it, and that persistent focus and that persistent leadership.
A lot in laying out the initiatives, you talked a lot about some of the barriers that you've identified and are trying to address in a fairly systematic manner. Are there barriers that you see that, it's still a work in progress to figure out how do we deal with this, that there's not an initiative on your list of 9 to deal with, or maybe the initiative is just scratching the surface. But what are the barriers that are the sort of toughest nuts to crack in your view?
Flexibility, I think, will continue to be a barrier. You know, some of my 9 talk to flexibility, but flexibility is a very broad topic. So, for example, the first panel we heard talk about childcare and child development centers, and the times that the CDCs are open are not always convenient to all military members, and the shift work that goes on and so forth. So that's a problem. And you know, to have CDCs open 24 hours is probably not practical given the cost of that and so forth. So that requires backup plans for parents and things like this. But looking for ways to provide that additional flexibility, we have to keep on the hunt for that, number one, and listen to our airmen. So we can't, of course, institute every new idea that comes to us, but we do get a number of very good ideas, and we try to listen carefully and implement where we can.
Yeah. Staying on this point about career flexibility and the ever-elusive work-life balance, when I I don't know what your experience has been, when I first put that on a slide at DoD, I got open laughter. People just thought, you know, what planet is she on? There is no work-life balance here. But
you have a life, you mean you have a life beyond work?
But I think, you know, this is not only for women, but for parents and for millennials. I mean, I think this question of how does the Air Force, how does the military think differently about career paths and about promotion timelines and paths to allow, I mean, I thought the career intermission, is that what the right, yeah, intermission program, the SIP, was a great idea. But, you know, the idea of sabbaticals, the idea of fellowships. You know, we have a wonderful group of military fellows at CNAS that's hopefully having a mind-expanding experience with us while they're here. But, you know, creating a variety of experiences over the course of a career and an incentive program that says, you know, taking advantage of those opportunities doesn't necessarily penalize you in terms of promotion. I mean, are you all thinking about the broader question of career path flexibility? And tell me what you're thinking about that.
We are thinking about this. I mentioned a call to the future, which is a strategic framework that we released last summer. It's about a 20-page paper that talks about where we were going in the future as the United States Air Force. But it was very much, I'll say, a beginning document. We're going to be doing a human capital development plan to go with that document as an example. And we hope to sort of explore the very topics that you're talking about in a little bit more detail. I think to crack this nut eventually, we probably will need, and I would argue the time has come that we need sort of a fundamental review of DOPMA and ROPMA, which the Defense Officer Personnel Management Act, the Reserve Officer Personnel Management Act. So a lot of what we do is governed by very strict laws and regulations. And so after 30-some years, it probably is time to fundamentally relook that so that we can get more flexibility and shape ourselves differently for the future.
You talked very personally about your own experience with mentors and the importance of mentors in your career. And I know I certainly have, you know, would say exactly the same. What's your advice to people on how to find or attract mentors? How does that relationship happen? I mean, I think it's great that you have an online tool to try to, you know, kind of matchmake between people. But from your experience, how do you cultivate those mentors? How do you find them?
I'll tell you how I've done it. I usually will target someone who is doing something that I aspire to do, or someone who has a quality or an experience that I think might be of interest to me. And I just believe, you know, very directly will go up to the person and ask that person to have coffee with me and to talk with me. I mean, this is how I originally, believe it or not, met this gentleman I told you all about, whose name is Bob Kimmett. I was I was a presidential management intern, and I heard this gentleman, Bob Kimmett, from the NSC staff, speak at a conference, not unlike this conference. And when it was all over, I literally went up to him, I introduced myself, I told him about my program, and I said, would you be willing to have coffee with me someday? And it was out of that that literally I got this opportunity to go as an intern to the White House. So that's my approach. I always believe in going on the offense. And ultimately, as much as we in the military try to be leaders and help other people with their careers, and I'm absolutely convinced we can do a better job of that as leaders, ultimately it's on all of us, right, as individuals, to be the best proponent for our own careers. And you'd be surprised if you just ask people to have coffee and a little bit of advice. My experience is they will do it for you almost every time.
Right. And a related concept to mentorship is sponsorship, where a senior person takes a more active role in helping to create opportunities for a protege or what have you. And I know that in the military and in the national security field more broadly, a lot of these relationships go beyond mentorship to actually be active sponsorship. The challenge is that, as human beings, we tend to fall into the mini-me trap. I'm going to find someone that looks like me, reminds me of me at that age, and I'm going to help that person up. And when you are in a male-dominated environment and force, that doesn't work so well for young women who are looking for opportunities and sponsors. So how do you address that kind of issue with your leadership, with the folks making your development teams who are evaluating the talent pipeline, with your promotion boards? How do you kind of break the mini-me mentality that's inside the military?
Well,
sometimes?
You just said it, Michelle, the initiative concerning the development teams. So again, under the example that I offered, if you take this space career field, you have space-savvy people who are sitting on top of that development team, and they are looking at the people who serve in that career field, and they're trying to figure out, within, of course, parameters and under the law and regulations that we have in our system, what sorts of jobs do certain people need, and what are the key jobs which could lead to other jobs, and who needs to get joint at a certain point in time, and what about the educational opportunities, and who would take the slots in this given year. That's why those development teams are so important, because they're not sponsors, and again, they're not exactly advocates, because we don't do that in our system, but they've got their eye on the ball of their individual career fields. And so the spirit of that recommendation, or that initiative, I should say, is that we want those developmental teams thinking about diversity and inclusion in our Air Force, and we want them to be thinking about leaders who they're developing, who will have that spirit of appreciating diversity and inclusion in the Air Force. And so that's specifically why that initiative is part of our package.
Right. So before, we're going to open it up to our audience Q&A, so please come to the microphones. I'm going to ask one more question that I almost have to ask, because you are here today, and it's such an important issue for the U.S. military writ large and for the Air Force, and that is about the service's efforts and your efforts and General Welsh's efforts to combat sexual assault and sexual harassment. What's your assessment of how the department's doing, how the Air Force is doing? And we talked earlier about antibodies, the risk that some of these efforts will actually engender antibodies that are counterproductive. So give me a sense of your sense of the state of play and how we're doing.
I think we're doing better. We're not doing well enough. This is another area that we have got to keep on it and provide that persistent focus and leadership. I say we're doing better for a number of reasons. Number one, if we look at the macro level statistics, we seem to be trending in the right direction. Again, it's not good enough. We want to do better, but at least it's coming in the right direction. So by that specifically, I mean that in terms of the prevalence year over year, our prevalence, meaning how many sexual assaults occurred in the previous year, that number has come down. So again, that's going in the right direction. The other number that we watch is the number of reports that are made. A report can be something that just happened to me, or it could be something that I experienced 15 years ago. So reports don't necessarily mean assaults in any given year. You want reports to go up because that is an indication that people are beginning to trust the system more. People are willing to come forward in either a restricted or an unrestricted way and say, this happened to me and I would like some help. So reports are up, and we think that's a trend in the right direction, and prevalence year over year is down. Again, good macro level. The other point that I always look at is my own sampling. So I'm a little bit of management by walking around, you might say. So I've traveled a fair amount over the last 14, 15 months in the Air Force, and every military base I visit, which I think I'm up to about 60 now, one of the things I always do is I meet, and I meet privately, with our SARC on scene. So that's the Sexual Assault Response Coordinator. And I close the door, and it's just me and the SARC, and I say, how are we doing? How are you doing? How's it going here? How's the training going? What do the numbers look like? So I have a series of questions, and it's always private. So I do that in the hopes that I'll get the most candid information possible. And our SARCs tell me that, particularly those who have been at this for some number of years, it's like night and day in terms of the focus that this receives and so forth. What they also tell me, and this is important to this whole aspect of training, and is it overkill, or how does the force react to the training and whatnot, I agree with the first panel. These long PowerPoint, dull, boring presentations are basically the wrong way to train virtually in anything, I would submit, but certainly in this category. And so we've learned that lesson, and we are trying very hard to switch up this training. I think all the services are doing this. We certainly are doing it in the Air Force. What we find works best tends to be more peer-to-peer. So, you get the young people together, small group environment. Now, of course, you have to have someone who can facilitate it and whatnot, somebody who really knows enough of the material. But peer-to-peer, small group, and get people really dialoguing about this. And so you're going to see increasingly that's the way we're all going in terms of our training. And I'll say minimize the more large group PowerPoint type presentations. And this year, the training will be focusing specifically on retaliation, because that's the other macro level statistic that we're not satisfied with. And we realize that we need to attack this issue of retaliation. And by the way, for the Air Force, I believe the bulk of the retaliation that victims feel tends to be, again, from peers as opposed to from the boss. Not to say there isn't some from bosses, but I think it's mostly peers. It's where someone is assaulted and then the peers in the unit don't know what to do, or they don't know what to say, and maybe they say the wrong thing, or maybe they say maybe they say nothing at all. That can be the wrong thing too. And so trying to give airmen tools about how to handle this situation. When I say tools, I mean what to say verbally, what not to say, how you might consider handling this if such a thing happens to one of your buddies or your friends, and not to take sides, not to rush to judgment about these matters. So again, a little bit about how we're switching up the training.
That's great. Yes, first question over here.
Hi, I'm Captain Abigail Gage, U.S. Army, well, Maryland National Guard now. A couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to be one of the first 5 women to go to the Maneuver Captain's Career Course, and my millennial infantry and armor peers were wonderful. The international students were a little bit more hesitant to deal with me, and I was wondering if this, in the sense of culture and our ongoing op-tempo overseas, if you could address how our push to close the gender gap here in the U.S. military can affect and hopefully influence our international partners that we'll be working with.
I hope you're right about that, that over time this would influence our international partners, but of course our international partners have a wide, differing cultures and whatnot, and I don't think we can overpromise that just because we are having a focus on this in the U.S. military, that this will necessarily go to all of our partner militaries that we work with. But I think it is also true that many around the world, particularly mill-to-mill, do look to the U.S. military in many significant ways. They want to train with us and be more like us in a variety of areas. I know our enlisted corps in the U.S. military at large is the envy of many, many other militaries around the world, and that's the same for the officer corps. So I think what we do it really does matter. And over time, I think we will make a difference there as well.
Great. We have another question over here.
Good morning. I work for the Netherlands Embassy, and specifically at the Department of Defense. And I was wondering, the initiatives that you have are really, really great, but how do you think that you can sustain them over time, since we have so many problems with budget cuts not only in the US, but everywhere around the world. Every defense is shrinking the people within the Defense Department. How is that going to be different for the US? How are you going to face that challenge? Because I hear we have different threats right now, and why or how we can develop women leadership, but we have another problem, that is the shrinking of the defense by itself. So regardless of they are men or women, how do you plan to keep that sustainable throughout the time?
The budget cuts that we are all looking at, and sequestration in particular, if it's not lifted, is going to damage all different parts of our national security. So it's going to be bad for people, it'll be bad for procurement and research and development, and you name it. It's a bad deal. So we are trying to get that message across in every way that we know how. Now, looking at people for just one more moment here, in the Air Force, this is not sort of known, I don't think, generally across America, but the Air Force has been downsizing for the better part of 20 years. So when Michelle and I were in government in the 1990s, we had approximately 200,000 more people, more military people in the Air Force than we have today. So, you know, as we talk about downsizing certain parts of the military after the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, you know, it's entering into a different phase, of course, and people say, well, you know, how about downsizing? Well, we're already there in the United States Air Force. So this is a challenge no matter what, because we're already much smaller. But I'm here to tell you, if we don't get it together, and if we don't figure out better diversity and inclusion, we're not going to be much of an Air Force, or as good of an Air Force as we ought to be 50 years from now or 30 years from now. We have got to get it together because of the changing demographics of our own country.
We could go on with this conversation because it's been terrific, but I promised the Secretary that we would actually get her back to the Pentagon to continue her real job. But you have given us so much to think about, and we really appreciate your vision and your leadership and your candor and all that you're doing. So please join me in thanking Secretary Burns.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle.
We have two members of Congress here, both military veterans. If you could both introduce yourself and talk about your service.
Sure. Well, good morning. Or we're still morning, right? I'm Martha McSally, and I represent Arizona's 2nd Congressional District. I'm a retired Air Force colonel. I went to the Air Force Academy and then 22 years active duty. I was an A-10 Warthog pilot. I was privileged to be in the first group of women to fly, transition into fighters, and first to fly in combat in U.S. history, and then later on first to command a fighter squadron in combat. One other point of note, you may remember back in early 2001, 2002, I was the one who took on the Pentagon for making our service women wear burqas when they were off base in Saudi Arabia. Fought the Pentagon for about 8 years, then filed a lawsuit against Donald Rumsfeld, and then got legislation passed to overturn that ridiculous policy once and for all. Been in Congress for about 60 days, and looking forward to the discussion today.
Aloha, I'm Tulsi Gabbard, and I represent Hawaii's 2nd Congressional District. Next month is my 12th anniversary of serving in the Hawaii Army National Guard. I enlisted in 2003, served on my first deployment to Iraq with a medical unit as an enlisted soldier, came back, and shortly after coming home, I went through Officer Candidate School and earned a commission and branched military police. Had the privilege of taking a platoon on my 2nd deployment to Kuwait, 2008 and 2009, and was elected to Congress in 2012. I serve on the Foreign Affairs Committee and the Armed Services Committee, both of which I love very much, and both of which I feel are very synced and dovetailed very well together as we look at the challenges, the issues, the threats, and the opportunities that exist for the United States, for our service members around the world. Thanks. Great to be here.
Thank you. And Congressman Gabbard and I have something in common. We spent a little time at a place called Balad Air Base in Iraq a few years back, at a time when it was called Mortaritaville, because of all the mortars coming in. We remember that quite well. I want to start by saying both of you are officers, or were officers, leadership roles. What will it take, do you think, to get more women into leadership positions, high leadership positions in the military? Congressman Gabbard?
I think it's a couple of different things, or a variety of factors. I think one is just by virtue of the pipeline, as you have more women who've served, whether specifically in combat MOSs or roles, but who have time serving in leadership positions overseas. You know, that adds to their being really competitive for leadership positions. But I think it's also how we look at how people are selected for command. With the changing dynamic where we're not looking at constant deployments, many of the women who, you know, I was at West Point about a week and a half ago talking to the senior class there, and there is a sense of uncertainty amongst these kids who are about to get their commission and take their first platoon leader job about, you know, how competitive they will be given the fact that there's not a certainty of having that deployment leadership experience. So obviously there's a variety of positions and a variety of experiences that define and make a good leader, and I think we've got to take that into account as we look at women advancing through this pipeline, but also as we look at the future that we're facing right now and where our military is and what kinds of roles and responsibilities that will consist of.
Right. Now, one important point is, of course, with ground units, they're looking at integrating women into infantry, artillery, and armor starting next year, next January, unless the services ask for a waiver. But of course, in the Air Force, women have been flying attack aircraft now for more than 2 decades, since the first Gulf War, when it was a big controversy back then, you may remember.
Oh, yeah.
Can women fly F-18s? Can they fly F-16s?
I remember well the Chief of Staff of the Air Force testifying before Congress that he'd rather take a less qualified man instead of a more qualified woman, and he couldn't justify it. It was just the way he felt. And all the arguments against why women couldn't be fighter pilots, you know, we as a class didn't have the physical strength, or we didn't have the warrior spirit, or all the good order and discipline issues. I mean, these are all recycled arguments that we're seeing come up again related to integration in other areas. But you know, I've been a long-standing advocate that we need to pick the best man for the job, even if it's a woman, that we need to set standards, not artificial ones, not randomly like, oh, you got to bench press, you know, 250 pounds just because we want to, but because you need that for the job. But also, we need a lot, you know, it's not just physical strength that anybody needs for any job, right? You need aptitude, you need courage, you need wisdom, you need restraint, you need leadership. I mean, when you look at the strategic corporal, in any job, I have been very much an advocate that we need to have full integration of women into every position in the military that they are qualified for, period. I mean, this is about national security, and it's about making sure we have the most qualified. So there's been a lot of emotional arguments against women serving in positions, and recently we've still seen them with the opening up or potential opening up of the ground combat positions. And you know, I was on Fox News Sunday debating somebody about this, and I said, you know, so let me get this straight. You know, Justin Bieber's qualified and Serena Williams is not. I mean, that's just, you know, you got to treat people as individuals, right? Treat people as individuals, set the standard, and pick the best person for the job. So I've watched this and lived it and written about it, spoken about it, and published about it. We've got to change this culture. What we are, you know, to answer your first question, we have a culture that I've seen since I entered the Air Force in 1984, where generally I entered and inherited a culture where the men are the warriors and the women are the support people, right? And so we've had this culture of, you know, I'm going through the same training as everybody else at the Air Force Academy. We're going to go through the same pilot training. They get to be the fighter pilots. We have to be the cargo pilots. You know, we're going to be in the infantry, and you're going to be in the medical fields. And so we've had this culture in our military that I've seen in my lifetime is one of more and more positions open to women, but it's still kind of been like, we're the warriors and you're not. Mm-hmm. And that translates to the senior leadership, because obviously most of our senior leaders are the warriors, are the ones that have been, regardless of the service, those that are out there in the warfighting positions. And I will tell you, what we shouldn't be doing in order to move some of this forward is just put women in positions they shouldn't be in, or promote them in order to have a woman there. And as much as I appreciate the Secretary of the Air Force's initiatives, there's been some criticism about some things that she's done related to that. And so we can't just have women.
Criticism along what lines?
You know, we can't just, let's put a woman in a 3 or 4 star position, just so we have a woman up there. We've got to make sure it's the best person for the job. I don't want to name names here. I don't want to get into that. But the point is, we can't be moving the bar so much that we want to get more women somewhere that we overdo it. And then what you do is you add to this cultural issue that I mentioned, which is, oh, women aren't really the equal warriors. They're just getting ahead because they're a woman, or they're a quota, or somehow they're being treated specially. Because then that inculcates the culture of resentment that you don't really belong here fully because you're being treated differently. So there's really a sweet spot there. And in my career, we've really overdone it in some areas at times, and it adds to the resentment. So you have to be very careful.
But given the fact that women have been flying attack aircraft now for more than 2 decades, shouldn't we be seeing more women in upper positions in the Air Force in particular?
Well, okay, so I was in that first group, okay? And so if you look at, you can't artificially create a squadron commander, group commander, wing commander, numbered Air Force commander until they have the experiences to get there, right? So I will tell you, it's taking time, and we now have Jeannie Leavitt, as an example, was our first fighter wing commander. I think she's now a 1-star general. So she's kind of on that leading edge. She was in that first group with me. But I will tell you where I think, as I looked at some of the initiatives we've got anyway in the Air Force, and I think it's across all the services, the point I would like to focus on is the command select process. We've got promotion board processes that are pretty above board and mandated by law to make sure that there's no good old boy network stuff going on. But the command select process is basically a little mini promotion board between 06 and 07 that, in the Air Force anyway, is very much like a 7th grade dodgeball picking team. Right. That's how it was described to me by one wing commander. I mean, you meet the board, and it's all above board, and there's no funny business going on.
So how do you change that?
But then it's like, I want to pick that guy to be on my team, and that guy, and it's all about who you pick. So that'll be one of the things I'm working on in this year's defense bill, is we really need to take a hard look at making sure that that is also above board, that it's not nepotistic, it's not people picking people that they like or their sponsors or the good old boy network, because that's where, and it's not just women. You could have very qualified men that are bypassed because they don't have somebody above them who picks them in the dodgeball team. So, we got to make sure we have the most qualified, capable people that are in command positions, and that needs to be above board, in the light, and it needs to be competitive and meritocratic, and not based on who you like or who you know.
Now, you were an A-10 pilot, and as you know, the ground forces, there's no one they love better than an A-10 pilot. We're not going to get into the A-10 versus other aircraft right now, but let's talk about ground forces, because that's the big story this year. I was down at Camp Lejeune. They're putting a group of women, 100 women and 200 guys. They have this experimental battalion. They're putting them through their paces. They just went out to the Mojave Desert for live fire training. They're going to continue this right through the end of May up in the hills in Bridgeport, California. And next month, the Army Rangers are going to have their first class with women in it. And so let's talk about standards, gender-neutral standards, because that's been one of the big issues. Privately, a lot of retired males in particular are saying they're going to lower the standards, they're going to water them down so women can get in. You hear that in some of the Marines I spoke with down at Lejeune privately saying that they don't think this is a good idea, that women don't have the upper body strength to make it in the infantry. And if you look at the infantry officer course in the Marine Corps, dozens of women have tried to go through that. Not one has made it through. With the Ranger training, they only have 6 women so far that will be able to go through the full 2-month training for Rangers. So it leads to the question of the standards, and are they too high? And General Dempsey, when they announced ending the ban on women in combat, he said, listen, if we decide that a particular standard is so high that a woman couldn't make it, the burden is now on the service to come back and explain to the Secretary, why is it that high? Does it really have to be that high?
And I think that's really the point is, you say, well, it's too high or people want to lower it. The women who I talk to are not looking for an easy way in to the job. When I went through my MP basic course, there was a 5'4" female lieutenant who did 115 push-ups in 2 minutes for the PT test, more than any man in our class. So again, it goes to the person, it goes to their capabilities, and it goes to their ability to do the job. So the question about standards, I think, rather than saying, well, is this too high for women or too low for the men, is what does the job require? And do the standards for physical tests and training meet that standard and allow the service member to exceed that standard? You know, I think what is often taken out of context when you look at, you know, you said there were dozens of women who tried to go through the infantry officer basic course. Look at the overall washout rate generally across the board. How many people, men, traditionally, obviously, they've been the only ones allowed to have access to this, have gone through? And what's the washout rate for that infantry training? What is the washout rate for men going through Ranger School?
Infantry officer courses, I think 25% washout.
Yeah, I don't know
Ranger
the numbers
course
off
like
the top of my
40%.
head. So if you look at, you know, the few women who have had this opportunity, you can't say with a broad, oh, well, you know, well, that proves the point, women are not capable of doing this. I think it forces the question about standards meeting the necessity for the job.
Yeah, and I think it's unfortunate that the opening up of positions for women to serve has actually sparked the discussion of what are the standards. Because if we had an artificially high standard for a job that had nothing to do with the job, but was just sort of the way we've always done business, that should have been looked at anyway, because especially at times where we've had challenges with recruitment and retention, like in the 2005, 2006 timeframe, you know, we were lowering standards for men to get into the services. At the Army in particular was having a really hard time. So high school diploma, that standard got dropped. Your aptitude test, the standards got dropped. Criminal records, standards got dropped. So physical strength is only one of many characteristics that we want in our fighting force, right?
Still, but there are requirements for Ranger training in the IOC as well.
Right, exactly. Right. And so I think the key is that we need to make sure that we have standards that are the right standards to fit the job for defending America, for fighting in that position, whatever that is. And then you pick the best man for the job, even if it's a woman. But we often get wrapped around this physical upper body strength, which, look, you need to have the strength to do the job, period. But whatever that is, figure it out what it is, be gender neutral about it, don't be emotional about it. And then, you know, if you're going to waiver aptitude, you don't be like, oh, well, a bunch of men got in who were lower aptitude. Nobody says, well, men don't belong in the infantry. It's just, it gets wrapped around in all this emotional stuff.
But again, if no woman can make it through the infantry officer course in the Marine Corps or the Ranger course, should the Pentagon and should Congress, as General Dempsey suggested, at least look at the standards and see why are they that high? Why do they have to be that high?
But again, I don't think it has to do with women. It has to do with the standard. Why is the standard artificially high? And having worked with a lot of people in all the services in the frontline positions, I mean, there is very much a whole, well, if you have to do 20 pull-ups, let's try and do 30. Like, so there is a, you know, you want to be able to be the best of the best. Look, I was a triathlete. I did the Hawaii Ironman triathlon, and so, I mean, I'm into being strong and being physically fit, but when we've got to make sure that we have the physical standards for every position, for sure, but they shouldn't be artificially high for men or women. So again, I think they're two separate discussions. It's not about whether women can make it or not. It's about what's the standard for that job to include physical strength and other things, and make it set
the standard for that job as it applies to the world that we live and operate in today.
Yeah. Right.
And I think as you see a lot of young, you know, obviously I'm speaking from the Army perspective, just from my experience, you see a lot of young soldiers coming up and questioning, what does, you know, a PT test that judges push-ups, sit-ups, and a 2-mile run have to do with the job that you want me to do in the field today?
Right.
And I think that's really the bigger question that all of this is all interconnected with.
And the Army's working on that. We don't have a sense of what kind of standards they'll come up with. But let me just throw out the Ranger standards now in their PT test. 49 push-ups. Why 49? My wife said, why not 50?
48.
59 sit-ups, 6 chin-ups, and a 5-mile run in less than 40 minutes. Now, who came up with that?
This is the whole point.
Yeah.
But again, it's
and it's not World War II. I can't imagine you'd have to run 5 miles in less than 40 minutes.
Right, but it's problematic that this is all getting wrapped up in the women's integration issue, because if the standard does get adjusted in order to actually fit the job, which makes us a better force and makes entry tests be more fit to what you're doing in the job, then you're going to have the problem of they just lowered the standards to let women in. So it's been wrapped up in this, related to the issue of women's integration, but they are actually two separate issues, because there are men that can't meet these standards either, and we might be missing out on having qualified men in other areas. So they are two separate issues, although emotionally they are getting tied together.
Right, and that's what the Marines said when I was down at Lejeune. They said there were some guys that won't be able to make it through the physical tests that we're coming up with.
And just to put those numbers and those standards that you put into context, there's enlisted 2 officers, three Army women here, and I'm pretty sure that every single one of them could meet those standards. I think most women who I've ever served with could meet and far exceed those standards. I had a push-up competition.
Push-ups and
I had a push-up competition with my brother who thought, like, this is my little sister. Who does she think she is? We went head-to-head at a family reunion, and he got all jelly-bodied at about 45, and I kept going until I hit like 75 or something. Yeah. My point is, I'm not anything special in the Army. If you look at the women, I want to make sure to address that, because for people who don't do this every day, it might seem like a lot. That's not rock star, athlete, whatever standards. I mean, this is something that I think on average men and women across the military could meet.
I keep threatening to put in a pull-up bar at NPR to see how many people can actually do pull-ups. But let's go to questions now. Throw some hardballs. Don't be afraid. Let's have a good discussion here. And state your name and also your affiliation.
Hi, good morning, ladies. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Katie Van Dam, attack helicopter by trade in the Marine Corps.
Awesome.
I'm down in Quantico right now, and I actually teach young second lieutenants at our basic school. Like any physical or intellectual standard, a generation has to be given the opportunity to train for it. I will tell you, the young men that I see that go over to IOC, to our infantry officer course, they don't wake up one day and in 6 months decide they're going to be infantry officers. They train for it for a long time. Less than 2% of Navy SEALs are African Americans, and nobody's really talking about rescinding desegregation because of such a small number. So my question to you ladies is, especially because of your positions on HASC, what role do you see Congress playing to ensure the services are focused on validating standards instead of focusing on testing to submit exceptions to policy come January 1st, 2016?
I think your perspective and just what you shared right there is so important. And I think part of one of the problems that we've seen as we've gone through this conversation over the last almost 2 years since the Department of Defense changed their policy is we hear a lot from all of the branch chiefs. We hear a lot from the people in charge of these different areas, all of whom are very experienced, well-qualified men. Not from our young officers and our young female enlisted service members who are going through this experience or who have gone through this experience and really can shed a realistic light on this is the real world we live in, and this is how we get to that end state, which was set by this policy change.
Yep, and I would agree. We have an oversight role and we have a legislative role. So there could be things that we work together to, across the aisle, work together. Go figure. That'll never happen. But
well,
together
this is the area where it happens.
Yeah,
exactly.
So direct things through the defense authorization bill if we don't see it, going in the right direction, and we also can have hearings. We can have, which we've already, had. Since I've been meeting with a lot of the leadership before you get to writing them letters and directing things in legislation, give them an opportunity to address things themselves. So there's a lot of role we have in oversight that happens behind the scenes, some in public hearings, some in meetings and closed-door briefings and letters, and trying to get them to nip issues in the bud before we have to direct it. So it's really both of those roles, but we are committed on this issue.
Okay, right over here.
Good morning. I'm Lourdes Nealon. I'm the CNO Special Assistant for Diversity, and thank you for being here today to talk to us. My question is, because I've been in this job almost 2 years, there's senior leadership who get it, the diversity and inclusion. I think what I'm trying to do is convince the middle management which are the NCOs and the young up to executive officer, commanding officer level, that diversity and inclusion is a warfighting capability. There's been a lot of studies on the private sector on how well diversity makes the bottom line better. And I've also read the Air Force's study, which was somewhat subjective in the study, but I mean, what I think I'd like to do is to be able to present an argument that for the military, readiness does mean including the diversity and inclusion part. And where is that stated? You know, it's the prove it to me that it works, because you know what? We're working today, how does this make it better kind of thing? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a challenge for sure. I mean, I agree with you that diversity is a readiness issue, but the reality is, and forget about race and gender diversity for a second, just diversity in the way people think, right? Diversity in their backgrounds. It makes a team stronger. But we're fighting, I think, a culture that thinks that we all just line up and everybody, you know, it's almost a groupthink. You know, we all can come from the same mindset and therefore it's easier. It certainly is the path of least resistance to have a group of people who all think alike, but it doesn't make the unit or the mission better, right? So I mean, I don't have the studies behind that, but I could just tell you as a squadron commander, you know, I knew that I had people coming to work every day that were putting on their uniform, and especially fighter pilots, I tell you, where y'all are trying to kind of act the same because it's such a high peer pressure environment, right? And you had some people that came from very different perspectives, but unless I, as a leader, created the environment where they felt like they could share their different perspectives, they were all just going to kind of line up and try and behave the same. And so it takes leadership and an effort, even within a potentially looking ethnically or genderly non-diverse group, to encourage that diverse thinking, diverse, you know, way of addressing an issue, if that makes sense. So I think we've got a challenge because the majority, I mean, the leadership is still, it's a white male leadership, and it makes me comfortable in Congress, by the way. I've come from white male leadership in the military to white male leadership in Congress, but I'm totally used to it. But it's a problem. Issue. I mean, we just had a commission come before our committee, right, on reforming things related to compensation, and the entire commission was a bunch of men. And we're like, are you kidding me? We couldn't find one
and officers. There was no enlisted representation either.
And so, if I could just add, you know, you would think at this time in U.S. history, with the two wars that have been fought, that diversity would be almost a no-brainer. If you consider the female engagement teams in Afghanistan going out into the villages, because the guys can't go talk to women in the Afghan village. It's the women Marines that went out, not only got to know the women and got some useful intelligence. So it's kind of hard to believe this day and age, after more than a decade of war, that people don't realize that diversity is a readiness issue. If you could address that. And that's
a great issue. Just one second. Just, you know, again, oftentimes we do it a little bit, but we don't go the full thing. The better thing to have is a unit out there that has women in the unit, instead of adding women on the side. Like, oh, we need some women. Let's have some women engage over here. No, you have a unit with women in it, and the unit is involved in the counterinsurgency. So even when we're championing, look how diverse we are. We have female engagement teams.
Right.
Like, are you kidding me? We should have men and women serving in that unit together who then have a mission to do, and then the leadership will see it's not just a PowerPoint brief or a roll your eyes and comply with whatever the leadership's telling you. They get that it helps their mission.
Right. And Congresswoman, if you could address that, because you were on the ground in Iraq. I mean, talk about having women in a unit and just, again, the no-brainer of it helps when you go out on patrol and you have women out in the villages.
Well, my experience was actually the opposite. I was, you know, a gung-ho MP platoon leader getting ready to go on this deployment. One of our brigade's missions was convoy security from Kuwait into Iraq. And who better to do this than MPs? We have an MP officer here, fully trained to get the job done. And when I went to my commander and I said, hey, you know, I got this platoon of 45 soldiers. We're ready to take on this mission. The battalion commander for the unit that was tasked with said, no, I don't want any women working on this mission. And there was no reason given beyond that other than, you know, latrines, I don't know how they're going to go to the bathroom, and all this stuff that's, you know, you hear over and over and over again, which completely disrespects the professionalism of our service members. That we can go and be trained in everything, but somehow women can't figure out how to use the bathroom or how to take care of themselves. So, again, I think it does go to this making this change not as a challenge or a problem that's being forced upon people and that we have to overcome, but recognizing, again, with this world we live in, it's a very different world than existed even 10 or 20 years ago. And it's a real asset, and it's a real opportunity to strengthen our units, to increase that diversity, and increase their ability to be able to engage with people on a variety of different levels.
Let's go to another question over here.
Karina Robinson, a U.S. Army combat veteran, and I recently ran for Congress last year. Wasn't lucky enough to win, but the question I have for you ladies, as you've served in very transparent, ethical, mission-oriented environments in the military, when you transitioned and now you're in Congress, especially the committees that you're on, we recently saw the constraints on funding for DHS and how it might compromise national security. But do you in your hearts believe that we're going to become above that fray with more women, with more veterans serving in Congress? Or is it just going to take another national disaster to bring us all back together?
Well, I do believe that as you have more people who've worn the uniform, who understand what it means to put mission first, who understand what it means to put serving others before yourself, just that mentality alone, if you have more of that injected into this body, into what happens here in Washington, then you do have the ability to rise above the stuff and the noise and the muck that really gets in the way of us doing the people's business. If you look back in history, you look back to, I think, the height when there was, I think it was on average over 65% of members of Congress had served and worn the uniform. You saw a higher level of collegiality. You saw fierce debate, but at the end of the day, you saw people coming together and saying, all right, let's work this out, because this is about country first. And the fact that we have, and I'm glad Martha's here, that we have representation not only from women, but from women veterans, it does create a platform to be able to bring voice to many of our women who have not had a voice thus far.
Yeah, and I agree. On the veteran front, those of us who have served, look, we're about getting the job done. We're about service before self, all the core values, and the more we can have that mindset, I think the better off we'll be. A lot of people say, we need more women in Congress, period, right? Because we're supposed to be representing the country, and right now it's not representative. So that's easy. For the people who say, well, if we have more women, women legislate this way and men legislate that way, I'll tell you, as someone who has spent my whole life trying to defy gender stereotypes about how all women are this way and all men are that way, I kind of resist those stereotypical generalizations, right? Women legislatures will be this way versus men. Everybody's an individual. There's some very good men that are serving and very good women. So I don't like those generalizations, but I do believe that there are opportunities for us to work together as women, since there's such a small number of us. There's only 23 on the Republican side in the House, 23 women out of 247 that were elected, which is totally crazy. But there are opportunities, I think, for us to work together as women as we increase, we work to increase the number that are there. And I think that'll just be more representative.
Somebody else?
Hey, good morning. My name is Lauren Bosco. I'm a Marine C-130 pilot by trade. I also work down in Quantico at our officer candidate school. And I wanted to bring up something you talked about, changing the standards to make them relevant to the job at hand. And I think while this is for sure getting wrapped up in gender issues, and diversity, I believe, is incredibly important to mission readiness and all of that, how do we change those standards? And while we like to say change, we are basically talking about lowering those standards without destroying kind of the ethos of the service, in that while they are arbitrary numbers and you ask where we come up with them, and I don't think most of us really know why we run 3 miles in the Marine Corps or run 1.5 miles in the Navy or whatever it is, but being the best at whatever it is part of that screening process and part of what makes us prideful in our units and in our jobs and what we do. So the standard is high for a reason, and while PT or physical training is kind of the standard that is excluding women from these programs that we're specifically speaking of, does changing those standards to mission readiness also take away from who we are? Does saying, we don't want the best and the brightest anymore, we don't want the most intelligent and the most physically fit and the best leaders, we just want those who meet the standard, how do we go about including diversity without taking away from how do we push ourselves to be the best people we possibly can be?
I think there's a difference between just setting standards in order to be in a certain position, which includes aptitude, which includes high school graduation, which includes a physical standard saying, hey, in order to do this job, this is the standard. And I think that's what we're working for right now. That's one element. The second element is how do we strive for excellence in our culture and reward those that are performing and performing well, and that includes job performance, it includes leadership, and it also includes physical fitness. So I still think that we can strive and reward those who are exceeding and excelling and have that culture of standards and across the board, not just physical fitness, right? That could be our culture while we have a objective discussion about what's the minimum standard in order to do a certain job. Does that make sense? So, and a lot of people get caught up in we have these physical fitness tests and there's men and women have different, requirements for the physical fitness test, right? But nobody talks about how the old guys have a different requirement than the young guys. Look, the reason we have a physical fitness test is not the minimum to do your job, because an infantry officer and a JAG have to do the same physical fitness test. It's about you being kind of to the right hand of the bell curve for your age and gender of the population, so that you are in sharp and strong physical fitness for your stage in life, which we still are striving to be in the first 1 and 2 standard deviations to the right. So if we're going to go to we're starting one standard, that's great. Just make sure the old guys do what the young guys need to do. But
that'll never happen.
Yeah, that'll never happen. So let's ask. I think the annual physical fitness tests are about striving for excellence, kind of where you are in your age and your gender, and that's a part of one assessment. But we can still have just basic. What does it take to enter this job and do this job? Those I think are two different things.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of points here. I think agree. No one wants to take away kind of the warrior ethos and the elite feeling that comes with really achieving something at all levels, whether it's physical, your leadership skills, and all of the different things that are tested when you go to Ranger School. It's not just about the physical standards. It's about your ability. Really, ultimately, it's a leadership school, and your ability to perform under pressure and under fire while in the field and lead your team. So, I think to the point that was mentioned earlier, before we all jump to conclusions and say women can't meet physical standards, how about we give them an opportunity to try? How about we give them an opportunity to train and be prepared to meet the rigorous standards that are set for a reason? And let's make sure that reason is for a purpose and not just something that's arbitrarily set because it's been that way since, World War II. I think if we work on those two things and look at this from a more objective standpoint rather than disproving a negative, which is that women are weak, which is false, then we can actually get to the place where we all want to go, which is having a strong and ready force that's capable of and ready to do the job they need to do.
No, along those lines, let me just ask this and we'll go to you. Along those lines, when I was down at Camp Lejeune and they were just starting the experimental battalion with men and women, the first sergeant, this real character, said to me, listen, I'm not sure how many women at the end of this will make it through. It's 3 months of training. Again, live fire training, the Mojave, up in the hill country, 14,000 feet of Bridgeport, California. He said, my guess is, some of these women are really squared away. They're really tough. They're lifting the ammo can just like a guy can, the combat carry, everything. But he said, my guess is at the end of this, you're only going to have several women, a handful, make it through to the end of this training. And he said, if that's what happens, if you only have 3 or 4 women make it through, should you open up an entire branch, infantry, just because several women make it through?
Absolutely.
I just want you to address that. He asked the question.
That could be the next, chief of staff of the Army. And why would you just arbitrarily say they can't just because they're in a class of people that many of them can't? I mean, that's not what we're about. It's not what we're about as a country. That's not what we're about as a military. Why would you reject someone because they're in a certain class of people instead of looking at them as an individual? Just set the standard, and let's make sure we have the best qualified people, which includes all the things that we've mentioned so far. It's a bizarre argument.
I think that question just goes to the reality that we still deal with a culture that needs to be changed within our military, that women who serve are somehow disposable and who are not necessary to accomplish the mission, rather than seeing our female service members for the assets and the incredible contributions, not only that they will make, but that they have been making for decades upon decades upon decades, oftentimes with zero recognition.
We would have, back when I went through pilot training, we would have women graduating at the top of their class, and because they were a woman, they couldn't go be a fighter pilot. So the guy who was below them in the order of merit, who objectively was not performing as well, would go off and fly the fighter. And even though she was, in a small percent that's even attending pilot, why would you do that? I mean, if you want the best to be in those positions, why would you dip down and go to the next qualified person? It makes no sense.
We clearly have no strong feelings about this.
Right.
At all.
Tell us how you really feel.
Oh, there was a question back there.
Hi.
Right here.
I have the microphone. Can I?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, I'm Jenna Ben-Yehuda, Women's Foreign Policy Network. No combat experience, though I do have twins, so I hope that counts for something. I'm a little flummoxed, and I really appreciate Michelle Fournier's comment on sexual assault. Why isn't this more of this conversation? I get the flexibility issue. I really get that. I get the not having sponsors and mentors and senior leadership and the major attrition. But what about all of the women who are already serving, who are facing massive barriers in service of their country? Why is this not a crisis? Why wasn't it part of the remarks of our keynote speaker? She addressed it in the Q&A, but why are we not so seized with this? I know Tom Bowman has talked on this. Where's the urgency? It's a big problem affecting thousands of people's lives.
It absolutely is. And as we're talking about women serving in combat roles, as we're talking about women taking on different leadership roles, as it relates to your question about sexual assault in the military, which I have done a lot of work on and continue to be very focused on, this is one of the biggest misperceptions that exists there, is that there are more women who are victims of sexual assault in the military than men. The opposite is true. Not only are there more male victims of sexual assault in the military, but men are far more likely to underreport or not report those crimes than women are. So the issue of sexual assault in the military is not just an issue that affects women. It's an issue that affects all service members. It's an issue that affects our military justice system and how we make sure that these perpetrators receive justice for their actions and ultimately prevent this from occurring from within our ranks in the first place.
And I'll just add, I totally agree with Tulsi on those numbers. A lot of people don't understand the raw numbers, but percentage-wise, a higher percentage of women are being assaulted than men. And look, this is a complex issue, and we're doing a lot of things to address better care for victims, a stronger judicial process where there's due process and investigation and all that. But I still think we do need to also address some of the root culture issues that we've talked about a little bit today. That if we have a military that is inculcated with a dynamic of the men are the warriors and the women are second class, that is just another additive ingredient to the problem that is potentially going to create circumstances where someone does committed assault, or you then have someone in a leadership position who just doesn't get it because of their own experiences and their own perceptions of women, that they don't even understand, why they even had an environment. They don't even understand the issue. And so I think there is still a deeper cultural issue that starts at the very beginning when we put them through basic training, at the very, very beginning. And I've been asking a lot of questions to the Air Force, as an example, related to how we're training. We take these 18-year-olds who have no issues with having a female valedictorian or a female class president in high school. We put them through basic training. We basically segregate them. We say it's gender integrated, but you're going through basic training as men or women. We're worried about sexual assault, so we kind of lock them down like we have to protect the women behind lock and key so nobody can get to them. So we do like more segregation instead of more integration, right? So then we go through this whole thing where we're just trying to protect women, which is not helpful to us inculcating a culture that we're men and women serving alongside each other in the trenches, in the airplanes, everywhere. We are a team. We have a mission. We have to deal with these issues. It's a leadership issue. From day one, we're going to train you to that. And then we take them out of basic. We throw them into tech school or wherever they go to their follow-on, throw them into the dorms together. Hope it all works out, and then they often have like leadership who gets a couple PowerPoint briefs and doesn't understand, right? So there's a lot of deeper cultural issues that are adding to this very complex issue, which I really think not a lot of people are talking about. And I intend to continue to be raising that issue.
And you mentioned the urgency. Clearly, the Pentagon does what the Pentagon always does, come up with plans and programs and procedures and so forth. But my guess is the sense of urgency will only come when commanders take this seriously, right?
And I think
if they call
that
someone
the
into
Pentagon
a room.
is moving in that direction of not just the top line commanders, but really looking down the line and making sure that if a victim reports a case and it's not handled properly, if it's ignored, they're beginning to implement reporting procedures to make sure that all the way up the chain of command, people are made aware of it. So I think they're understanding, I think largely because Congress has really pushed this issue over the last couple of years, and it's become part of the public conversation, these changes need to be made, and there's far more work that needs to be done. But I think they're starting to kind of get why it's so critical.
Right. Would you agree with that, Congresswoman, that a commander calling his or her people into a room and saying, listen, I want you to deal with this issue, focus on it, and if something happens in your area, Captain Bowman, I'm going to come look for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Doesn't that focus the mind with the subordinates?
Look, often the Pentagon doesn't deal with something until it's a scandal or a crisis, and so the pressure is definitely on them, and they're dealing with it now. And having been a commander, I totally agree. This is about accountability of the commanders, but you also need to pick the right commanders. You have to address any cultural issues that are going on. Like if it's okay to just, to have sort of a sexually offensive environment in your squadron and sexual harassment's no big deal, and then you're trying to take sexual assault seriously, like there's still some deeper issues that have to be addressed. And then you often have commanders who just quite frankly are ignorant. They still think that sexual assault is somebody jumping out of the bushes with a ski mask who's a stranger, and that's the only thing. They don't understand how this staff sergeant who's got a wife and kids, could be someone who assaults. And so they don't, even if they understand they're accountable for it, they don't understand the complexities of the issue. So we need to address that at all levels.
Got it. Okay, and the woman back here.
Thank you very much, Christine Vargas-Avicent. Concerning standards.
Who are you with?
Avicent. We're a management consultancy that serves government-facing industry. Simply put, in terms of standards, do you feel that perhaps it's a larger human resources conversation? For example, are there sufficient celebrations of excellence along each military career path that could lead back to, here are the standards that we give our men and women to achieve those levels of excellence that we can celebrate? If you broaden the conversation across all career paths, including combat, then you have a basis on which to say, here's the standards we can use to train for each of these and celebrate each of these when you exceed them. If you took a step back and made it part of a larger human resources conversation, do you think that would give you more leeway to reshape standards across the board?
That's an interesting question. I mean, as we talk about physical standards, there's a lot of pride that comes with, if you take pride in wearing the uniform, you'll take pride in not meeting the lowest standard or the just passing standard. A lot of my soldiers strive always to earn that PT patch of excellence because of the pride that you get when you wear it, or knowing that, hey, you know what, I am the best of the best. There are a lot of other variables that are measured as people go through leadership schools, as they go through different training environments, or as they go out and conduct their missions. And frankly, I think that there are great opportunities where people are recognized and where you do have examples of excellence, not only to recognize that person's effort, but to recognize, to inspire those, to have an example for them to go toward. But again, I think as we go back to the question of, opening the doors for women to serve in some of these positions where women never have been allowed to, where there is no example, where there is no kind of role model. This is where we look, this is why we're having the conversation that we're having, and why ultimately, bottom line, what we all care about is that we have the best force to conduct the mission and get the job done. And I think that's where we need to stay focused.
Okay, I think we have time for just one more question over here.
Hi, Major Miriam Krieger. I'm a F-16 pilot in the United States Air Force. One of the conversation topics that came up in the previous two discussions was DOPMA, the Defense Officer Personnel Management Act, which is a promotion system that groups people by year groups that has been identified as disenfranchising, in particular, women, because it's difficult to sometimes take the time out to have a family and still meet the gates and the various wickets that your male counterparts who don't have to take that time off are able to better excel at. This is completely the purview of Congress. Is this an area where there's an appetite for change?
Absolutely, and this is something that where these conversations are happening to address this issue of the force that we see going forward into the future. What kind of force do we want to have where we can attract and keep our best service members, those who are most talented? And it is a competitive environment where people, like yourself, are making the decision, like, look, if I want to have a family, I might choose to go and work in the private sector because the military is not supporting my decision to have a family and to continue to excel and exceed at the job that I love and have been trained for in the Air Force or in whatever branch of the military. So it's something that I think that people are recognizing as the force is kind of trimming down in a lot of ways, that we want to make sure that our service members are the best and that we're retaining and keeping those not only who excel in training, but those who have the experience necessary when it comes down to time to perform.
Yeah, and I think initiatives like that are definitely worth looking into because, as I was mentioning, sometimes if we're trying to make life easier for women to stay in and we go a little too far, then what you do is you create sort of a double standard for women versus men that then creates resentment from the men, that the women are still filling the position but they don't have to deploy now or whatever that is, and you guys all know what I'm talking about. So if you can create more flexibility, I mean, if you were getting pregnant while you're in a deployable F-16 squadron, like that's kind of a nightmare all the way around. As a squadron commander, I mean, that would have been a nightmare for me. And so how do you have the flexibility to maybe step out for a little while but then come back at the right time, but not be hurting the squadron's readiness to deploy, not filling a position that you can't do your primary job, not creating resentment against you because you're not able to do that, and give you the flexibility to be able to enter back in and compete with your peers, but maybe 1 year behind. I think that's definitely the types of flexibility we need to be looking towards.
And just to close the loop on that, that this isn't just about creating an exception or a special treatment for women, but making it so that it's fair and equal across the board. If you have a man who's a single parent, for example, maybe in the same situation, or you have a man or a woman who says, look, I want to go and get this private sector experience for 2 years, gain from that and bring that back into the uniformed service. These are the kinds of flexible options that I think make serving in the military a far more competitive environment and where our military ends up winning at the end of the day.
Okay, I lied. This is the last question, I swear. Make it really short and wrap this up.
I will. Jeff Cathy, Bank of America. Thank you, Congresswomen, for your participation today and for your leadership. The question seems to me is, let's just kind of fast forward and assume that we knock down all the barriers and get it where it ought to be in A-10 squadrons and submarines and different units. Really seems to me like it's a fifth-generation leadership challenge to get the cultural aspect of how to lead a team that's going to be on their A game intellectually and physically at a varsity level to be able to perform. So that's, even if we get all this done through DOPMA and everything else and the career intermissions and everything else, it seems like that's the challenge, and we've got to kind of get ahead of the bow wave on that. Invite your comments on it. Thank you.
I mean, leading any group of people to go put their lives on the line is a challenge, and making sure you have core values and good order and discipline regardless of whether there's a gender issue there. So I mean, this is why leadership gets paid the big bucks, right? I mean, that's all just leadership 101. So I mean, I agree with you, but I don't think we need to be carving out special, like, this is just leadership. Leadership is treating everybody in the team with respect, making sure everybody's meeting the standards, making sure the job's getting done, you have good order and discipline, all that stuff. So just do your job. Not you, but the leaders.
This idea of leading a team in a high-pressure situation in combat, a team that's made up of men and women who are professionals, is frankly not something new. And I think a lot of the debate around this is so conflated in an unnecessary way and frankly in a distracting way. And I'm going to point to the military police corps as an example, because I know many women who choose to, either enlisted or officers, to go the MP route because it's the only branch of service in the Army that allows women to go out on the ground and conduct ground combat. And we've seen this over time in Iraq and Afghanistan for over the last 14 or 15 years that this has been the case. So you have a great example of an integrated force, an integrated team, whether it's a squad, a platoon, or a company, or whatever the size of the element is. And you have phenomenal female battalion commanders who are MPs who have successfully done this in combat over these past years. So this isn't breaking new ground here. You're just you're opening the doors officially with these other infantry and other combat roles. But if you're talking about that dynamic and the ability to successfully lead an integrated team of professionals, it's already been done.
Yep.
Okay, that's all the time we have. Great questions. Thanks to the Congresswoman.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you to Congresswoman Gabbard and McSally. And thank you very much to Secretary James and everyone else who has been a part of this conversation today, especially all of you. I want to invite you to join us in this project going forward for the next 15 months. It's going to be a project that we are very deeply committed to, in part because of what you heard today. We too often see these issues in a vacuum or through a narrow lens, that it's about diversity, or it's about criminal justice, or it's about equity. But it's bigger than that. It's about readiness, it's about national security, it's about the health of the all-volunteer force. And so going forward, we're going to continue to work on these issues. We're going to work on these issues both insofar as they relate to women in the military and national security, but also as they relate to the all-volunteer force as it turns 42 this year. And we're going to continue this not just in the Defense Department context, but also as a civil military matter and as a public-private matter. I want to thank, again, our distinguished panel, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, Congresswoman Martha McSally, and Tom Bowman, both for your work today and also for your service broadly. And thank all of you for coming. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event.